I never thought a camping trip could go so wrong. It was supposed to be just a simple weekend getaway. A couple of friends, some beers, a campfire, and a break from the grind. It sounded so easy when we planned it. But nothing ever goes the way you expect, does it? It started on a Friday afternoon. Me, my friend Mark, and his cousin Jason had all piled into Mark's truck and drove out to the woods just outside of town. We weren't looking for anything fancy, just a basic spot with enough space to pitch our tents, a good place to start a fire, and a bit of seclusion. We didn't want to be surrounded by other campers, so we found a place deep in the forest, near a quiet stream that Mark had found on a map. The air was cool, the sun still high in the sky, and everything seemed perfect. We got our tents set up and cracked open the first couple of beers before we even thought about starting the fire. The day was lazy. We had our usual routine, cracking jokes, talking about old times, and trying to one-up each other with exaggerated stories from our past. The stream gurgled quietly in the background, and the smell of pine and fresh earth filled the air. As the sun set, we built the fire and cooked our simple dinner, hot dogs and beans, and it was everything we had hoped for. The fire crackled, and we kept the conversation light, enjoying the warm glow as the chill of night settled in. The woods around us felt peaceful, familiar in a way, though the occasional rustle of leaves in the distance made me uneasy. I brushed it off. Animals were probably just moving around, no big deal. After we ate, we sat by the fire, the flickering flames casting dancing shadows across our faces. Mark pulled out a flask of whiskey, and we took turns drinking from it, the warmth of the alcohol fighting the cold of the night. I don't know when it happened, but somewhere in the middle of our quiet conversation, I realized it had gotten eerily still. The usual sounds of nature, the chirping of insects, the rustling of trees had faded. It was as if the woods had suddenly stopped breathing. I didn't mention it at first. It was probably just me, overthinking things. But then Mark and Jason noticed it too. We all exchanged uneasy glances, but no one said anything. We tried to laugh it off, poking fun at how quiet the forest was. But it didn't really help. There was something wrong. It wasn't that the woods were empty. It felt more like they were watching us, like the trees themselves had become aware of our presence. "We should probably get some sleep," Mark said after a while, breaking the silence. We all agreed. Jason crawled into his tent, and Mark and I stayed by the fire for a few more minutes, staring into the flames. I was just about to follow him when I heard something, a soft, almost imperceptible sound, like footsteps in the leaves. I froze, straining to listen. The sound came again, slow and deliberate, like someone was walking around the camp. Not in a hurry, not trying to be quiet, just walking. I glanced at Mark, but he didn't seem to notice. I had this feeling that someone was out there watching us. It wasn't the first time I'd had that feeling while camping, but it had never been this strong. I stood up and grabbed my flashlight, the beam cutting through the dark. I swept it over the surrounding trees, but all I saw was the thick blackness of the forest. Nothing. "You good?" Mark asked, looking up from his seat by the fire. "Yeah," I replied, forcing a smile. "Just hearing things." Mark nodded, not questioning me further, and I returned to my tent. But sleep didn't come easy. The silence outside had become unsettling. Every crack of a branch, every gust of wind, made my heart race. My mind kept going back to those footsteps. They weren't animal prints. It had sounded like someone walking, just a little too deliberately. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, but that didn't stop the feeling that we were not alone out there. At some point, I must have dozed off because the next thing I knew, I was jolted awake by the sound of something hitting my tent. I sat up, my heart pounding in my chest. For a second, I thought it was just the wind, but then I heard it again, a dull thud against the side of my tent, followed by the sound of something dragging across the ground. My breath caught in my throat. Someone or something was outside. I waited for what felt like an eternity, straining to hear any movement. Nothing. No more footsteps. No more dragging sound. I slowly unzipped the door to my tent, peering out. The campfire was nothing more than dying embers now, casting a faint glow on the surrounding trees. There was no one in sight, no sign of movement. My flashlight was still in my bag, so I grabbed it and shined it around. Nothing. Just the dark expanse of the forest, silent and still. "Mark," I whispered, my voice shaking. No answer. I crawled out of my tent and made my way to his. When I reached Mark's tent, I shook it gently. "Mark, you awake?" No response. I pushed the tent open, fully expecting to find him sleeping. But when I looked inside, it was empty. I froze. Mark's sleeping bag was still rolled up in the corner, untouched. Jason's tent was the same. Empty, the sleeping bag neatly arranged. I started to panic. Where the hell were they? Had they gone off somewhere? I didn't remember hearing any footsteps or voices, but the thought of being alone in the middle of the woods, without Mark or Jason, set my nerves on edge. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped into the dark woods, trying to stay calm. I called out their names quietly at first, but then louder, my voice echoing through the trees. There was no answer, not a sound. I walked further, every rustle of the leaves making my heart race. The moon was covered by clouds now, and the only light I had was my flashlight, cutting through the oppressive darkness. The feeling of being watched hit me again, stronger this time. I spun around, the beam of the flashlight dancing in the trees. There was nothing there, just the dark, cold woods. I kept moving, hoping to find Mark and Jason, but the deeper I went, the more lost I felt. The woods were vast, unfamiliar. Every direction seemed the same, like the trees and rocks were closing in on me. That's when I saw it, a shadow moving between the trees. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. For a moment, I thought it was one of them, Mark or Jason, but then I saw it more clearly. It wasn't human. It was too tall, too wide, with limbs that seemed to stretch out unnaturally. My heart hammered in my chest as it moved further away from me, disappearing into the thick forest. I turned and ran, my feet tangled in the underbrush as I made my way back to the camp. But when I reached it, the fire was out. My backpack, my phone, everything was gone. I had no choice but to keep moving. I ran through the woods, hoping I could find my way out, hoping I could make it back to the road. It felt like hours before I saw the lights of a passing car in the distance. I flagged it down, and the driver, an older man with a confused look, stopped to let me in. I never saw Mark or Jason again. I never went camping after that. I don't know what happened out there, but I do know one thing: whatever it wasn't something we were meant to understand. I still hear the footsteps sometimes when I close my eyes, the sound of someone or something walking just behind me, just out of sight. And every time I wonder if they're still out there. I've been camping for years. It started with simple weekends, then a week here and there. Over time, it became more than just a hobby. It became something I needed, a way to clear my head, to escape the clutter of modern life. I knew the outdoors like the back of my hand. The forest, the campsites, the way the air smells in the morning after a night of rain. Everything felt like home. That weekend, though, something felt off. I couldn't put my finger on it at first. Maybe it was the weather. It had been unusually dry, and the air felt thinner than usual. Or maybe it was the fact that I was alone. Usually I camp with friends, but this time I was solo. Just me, my tent, and the firewood I had gathered earlier in the day. I had a good campfire going, the orange glow flickering in the quiet, the only sound being the crackle of wood and the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. The sky above was a deep navy, dotted with stars. I always loved how clear the night sky was when you're out in the middle of nowhere. I had made my way to a small, isolated campsite. It was a place I had visited several times before. It sat next to a narrow creek that ran through the forest, the gentle sound of water flowing over rocks always calming me. The trees around the site were tall, their thick trunks rising high above, casting long shadows over the ground. It felt peaceful here usually, but tonight, as I sat there by the fire, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I shrugged it off. Maybe it was just the isolation. Maybe I was just tired. I was used to the occasional unsettling noise in the woods, things rustling in the bushes, branches snapping in the distance. It was the sounds of the wild, nothing to worry about. But then I heard something that didn't sit right with me. It wasn't the usual animals or the wind. It was a soft thud, followed by the faintest scrape against the ground. It wasn't loud, but it was distinct. I sat up straighter, my eyes narrowing as I scanned the trees around the campsite. Nothing. The forest was quiet again, the kind of quiet that makes you aware of every single little sound. I told myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer or something larger moving through the brush. The sound had been too soft to be a person. Still, I felt a slight unease crawl up my spine. I poked at the fire, watching the flames dance in the night. My heart started to race just a little. The thud had been so strange, so out of place. I stood up, stretching my arms over my head, deciding to check things out. My flashlight illuminated the area around my tent, sweeping over the ground, the trees, the bushes. Nothing. It was just the same forest I had been in countless times before. I walked down toward the creek, the sound of the water calming my nerves for a moment. As I stood there, looking down at the rippling creek, something caught my eye. A figure, just at the edge of the light's reach. It wasn't a person, not exactly, but it was tall enough that I felt a jolt of panic. I quickly swung the flashlight toward it, my heart pounding. Nothing. I blinked, looking again, but all I saw was the dark expanse of trees. My breath was shallow, my mind racing. I thought I had seen something. Maybe it was just a trick of the light, the way the shadows moved. I stood there for a moment, listening, my senses on high alert. Then I heard it again, the soft scrape, closer this time. This time I couldn't ignore it. My mind was racing. It wasn't an animal. It was too deliberate, too slow. I turned around and hurried back toward the campsite. My flashlight flicked wildly through the trees, but there was nothing. Nothing but shadows and the dim light of the campfire. When I got back to the campsite, I quickly checked my gear. Everything seemed fine. My food, my tent, my axe, all in place. I sat down near the fire again, trying to calm my nerves. I told myself I was being ridiculous. It was probably just an animal or maybe someone else camping nearby. I had heard rumors about people sneaking around the woods, but that was just paranoia, wasn't it? I stared into the fire, my mind whirling. The scrape, the figure, something wasn't right. The night dragged on in silence, and I tried to shake off the feeling of being watched. The wind had picked up, rustling the leaves in the trees, and the fire crackled as the logs shifted. I focused on the warmth of the flames, on the scent of pine and smoke in the air. Eventually, the tension in my shoulders began to ease. Then the thud came again. This time it was much louder and much closer. I jumped to my feet, my heart hammering in my chest. I whipped around, scanning the trees with the flashlight. Nothing. No movement. The wind had died down, leaving an eerie stillness in the air. But the thud again. It wasn't a single sound. It was a rhythm, almost like footsteps, heavy and slow, coming from the direction of the trees behind my tent. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. I wasn't imagining this. There was something out there. I backed up, closer to the fire, my mind racing for a plan. What should I do? My instincts told me to run, but I knew that would make me an easy target if there was someone or something out there. I grabbed my knife from my backpack and held it tightly, the cold steel reassuring in my grip. I could feel my pulse in my ears, the blood rushing in my head. My eyes never left the dark forest, scanning for any movement. The thud came again, even closer, almost like it was circling me. And then nothing. No sound, no movement, just the cold air, the quiet. I waited for what felt like hours, the tension in my body unbearable. I didn't dare move, didn't dare make a sound. My flashlight flickered once, then went out. Panic hit me. I shook the flashlight, trying to get it to work, but the battery had died. I cursed under my breath, standing in the dark now, relying only on the faint glow of the campfire. My eyes adjusted to the dim light, but it made everything seem more ominous. And then, from the darkness, I saw it. A figure, tall, hunched, its limbs long and twisted. It wasn't human, at least not in any way I could understand. Its skin was pale, almost gray, and it moved slowly, deliberately, as though it knew I was watching. The moment I saw it, my breath caught in my throat. I froze, unable to move, unable to think. The figure stepped forward, its long arms dragging against the ground as it crept closer to my camp. I could hear the scrape of its limbs against the forest floor, like nails on a chalkboard. I had to do something, anything, but all I could think to do was yell. I screamed at the top of my lungs, the sound of my voice shattering the silence of the forest. It stopped. For a long moment, it didn't move. Then, slowly, it retreated back into the trees, its footsteps fading into the distance. I stood there, my breath coming in shallow gasps. My heart was racing. What the hell had I just seen? I couldn't make sense of it. I didn't know what it was or why it was here, but I knew one thing for sure. It wasn't something I wanted to encounter again. I packed up my gear in a frenzy, every instinct telling me to leave, to get out of there before whatever that thing was returned. I didn't stop to look back, didn't stop to grab anything extra. I just needed to get away. By the time I made it to my car, I was shaking, my hands slick with sweat. I fumbled for my keys, unlocked the door, and climbed inside. The engine roared to life as I drove away from that forest, from that campsite, without ever looking back. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest town. The whole time, I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see the figure following me, but it never did. I don't know what it was I saw that night. I've never been back to that campsite. In fact, I haven't gone camping since. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me. Maybe it was an animal or some strange phenomenon of the forest. But one thing's for sure, I won't be camping alone again anytime soon. I've always loved camping. The outdoors, the quiet, the simple beauty of nature. It's a kind of peace you can't get in a city. This time, though, I went camping by myself. I'd done it before with friends, but something about this trip felt different. Maybe it was the solitude. I didn't mind being alone, but as I set up camp, a subtle unease crept in. It wasn't anything I could pinpoint, just a vague feeling that something wasn't quite right. The campground I chose was remote, nestled deep in a dense forest far from the nearest road. There were no marked trails, no other campers around. I wanted the isolation. I set up my tent in the middle of a small clearing, surrounded by towering pines. The sun was still high, so I had plenty of time to get settled. I built a small fire pit, gathered some wood, and took my time. The air was cool, but not cold, just enough to make a jacket feel comfortable. Once everything was in place, I sat by the fire and stared into the flames. It had been a long drive to get here, but it was worth it. There was no noise, no one to bother me, just the sounds of the wind moving through the trees and the occasional rustle of small animals in the underbrush. My mind wandered as I sipped on a can of soda, feeling a strange mix of contentment and restlessness. As the day began to fade into twilight, the shadows around me grew longer. The fire flickered in the growing darkness, and I added more wood to keep it alive. I could hear the distant sounds of animals, birds calling out, a twig snapping somewhere off to my left. But then, there was another sound, faint but unmistakable. The sound of something walking, something large. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. At first, I tried to convince myself it was a deer or some other animal, but this didn't sound like the light steps of a creature moving through the woods. It was heavy, deliberate, like a person walking through the underbrush. I stood up, straining my ears to listen. The noise continued, but it didn't seem to be getting closer. It was moving in a slow, deliberate circle around my campsite. My mind raced with possibilities, none of them good. I grabbed a flashlight, but I didn't dare shine it into the woods just yet. Instead, I just listened, hoping it was nothing, but the sound didn't stop. I felt my pulse quicken. It wasn't the kind of noise made by animals. There was too much intent behind it. Whoever or whatever it was moving with purpose, as though it was trying to keep its distance but also not leave. I sat back down, trying to stay calm, and waited. The fire crackled, the orange light casting odd, shifting shadows on the surrounding trees. I forced myself to focus on the flames. Maybe it was a hiker or someone else camping nearby. But the more I thought about it, the less sense that made. The nearest campground was miles away, and I hadn't seen anyone on my way here. Not a soul. Suddenly, the sound stopped. Complete silence. My breath caught in my throat, and I held my flashlight tight in my hands. I couldn't decide what to do. Should I get in the tent and lock myself in? Or should I check it out? See what was going on? I stood up and walked a little ways from the fire, trying to peer into the trees. Nothing. The woods were still. I told myself I was being paranoid, that it was just the sounds of the forest playing tricks on me. So, I returned to my campfire, hoping the warmth and light would settle my nerves. The night grew deeper. I cooked some instant noodles and ate quietly, trying to ignore the gnawing unease that wouldn't leave me. The woods felt alive, in a way that was different from the usual peaceful ambience of a forest at night. It was as if the trees were watching, listening. Around midnight, I finally crawled into my tent, zipping it up tight. I thought that would be the end of it, but as I lay in my sleeping bag, staring at the ceiling of the tent, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Then, the sound returned, but this time it was closer. The crunch of leaves underfoot. Slowly, deliberately, I held my breath, straining to listen. The noise was unmistakable. Someone was outside my tent. My heart pounded in my chest, and I gripped the flashlight like it was a lifeline. For a moment, there was no movement. Then, the sound of something brushing against the side of my tent. I froze, not daring to make a sound. The brush of something against the fabric was gentle, almost tentative. It was as if whatever it was unsure, hesitant. Then it came again, this time a bit harder, and I could feel the tent shift slightly as if something heavy had just brushed against it. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I kept waiting, praying that whatever was out there would just leave. But then, something worse happened. A voice, a low, raspy whisper. I couldn't make out the words. It was more like a growl than speech. The hair on the back of my neck stood up as I lay perfectly still, terrified to make a sound. The whispering continued, and I realized with sickening clarity that it was coming from multiple directions. Whoever or whatever was out there wasn't just circling my camp. It was surrounding me. I could feel the cold sweat trickling down the back of my neck as the whispers grew louder, more frantic, like they were closing in on me. My mind raced, my pulse hammering in my ears. Should I make a run for it? Should I call for help? I had no signal on my phone, no way to get in touch with anyone. I was alone. The rustling outside stopped, and everything fell into an eerie silence once again. The fire had long since died down, and the dark enveloped me like a thick blanket. But in the stillness, I could hear something else. A slow, steady breathing. It wasn't mine. It wasn't animal. It was the unmistakable sound of a person, and it was right outside my tent. I wanted to scream, to shout, but I was paralyzed. I could hear it now, the shallow, raspy breaths growing louder, more uneven. Whoever it was, they were right there, waiting. Time stretched out. Every second felt like an hour. I could feel my heart thumping wildly in my chest, but I didn't dare make a move. I had no idea what to do. Every possible option seemed like a bad one. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the breathing stopped. There was complete silence, the kind of silence that presses in on you, making your ears ring. I waited. Nothing happened. No rustling, no whispers, no heavy breathing. The stillness was suffocating. Eventually, I summoned enough courage to unzip the tent just a little. I peered outside, careful not to make any noise. The fire pit was a smoldering pile of embers, casting a faint glow on the trees. I saw nothing. No signs of anyone, no movement in the shadows. Nothing. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. My eyes scanned the surroundings one more time, trying to make sense of it all. But there was no sign of anything unusual. No footprints, no broken branches. Just the same empty forest. I slowly crawled out of the tent, cautious but determined to know the truth. I wasn't going to let myself get spooked without answers. I walked around the camp, keeping close to the light from the dying fire. I checked the woods surrounding me, but there was nothing out of place. No signs of anyone or anything nearby. The hairs on my neck started to settle as I began to think it had all been some strange trick of my mind. But as I was walking back to the tent, something caught my eye. A small, dark shape on the ground by the fire pit. It was a rock, or at least it looked like one. I bent down to inspect it. It wasn't a rock. It was a bone. I jumped back, my blood running cold. It was small and looked like a human finger bone. My stomach turned, and I immediately felt sick. The whispers, the breathing, the presence. I wasn't alone in these woods. Something had been watching me. Something had been waiting. I didn't stay another minute. I packed up my things in a panic, my hands trembling as I shoved my gear into the bag. I didn't care about being neat or organized. I just needed to get out. I made my way to the car as fast as I could, glancing over my shoulder every few steps. Every sound in the forest seemed amplified now, like something was moving just beyond the trees. When I finally reached my car and slammed the door shut behind me, I didn't look back. I drove straight to the nearest town, shaking from head to toe. To this day, I don't know what happened that night, but I'll never go back to that spot. The forest is a place of beauty, sure, but it holds secrets, and some things are better left undisturbed. It started like any other weekend trip. I had been looking forward to this solo camping getaway for weeks. Just me, my tent, and the quiet of the wilderness. I needed a break from the noise of the city, from all the distractions that kept me locked in a cycle of stress and exhaustion. The woods were always a place of peace for me, a place where I could reconnect with myself and clear my head, or so I thought. I drove out early on Saturday morning, my car loaded with the essentials: tent, sleeping bag, food, and a flashlight. The weather was perfect, crisp autumn air with a slight chill, but the sun was warm enough to keep me comfortable. The drive was long, but the thought of solitude made it bearable. The last few miles were a gravel road, winding through dense trees, the road signs growing fewer and farther between. The world around me felt untouched, as if I was entering a place that hadn't been visited in years. I parked at the trailhead around noon, the only car in the lot. There was a map posted on the sign, but I didn't need it. I had been here once before a couple of years ago. It wasn't a popular spot, which was exactly what I liked about it.
No crowds, no noise.
Just the trees, the dirt, and the sound of my own breathing. The hike to the campsite was easy. Maybe an hour, maybe a little more, through thick woods with the occasional clearing that opened up to views of rolling hills in the distance. There were no signs of human life, no other campers, no homes, no signs of civilization. Just nature stretching out in every direction. The spot I'd chosen was a small clearing near a creek, where the sound of running water would lull me to sleep at night. I had camped there before, and it had always been peaceful. But this time, something felt off. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but as I set up my tent and arranged my things, I had the odd sensation that I wasn't alone. It was a subtle feeling, like the trees were watching me, or the wind was whispering secrets in my ears. I shrugged it off as paranoia. It had been a while since I'd spent a night in the woods alone, and I was probably just getting into my head. So I lit a fire, cooked some food, and settled in for the evening. The sky darkened slowly, and the temperature dropped, but the fire kept me warm. The flickering flames cast shadows on the ground, dancing around the base of the trees. As the hours passed, the quiet of the forest settled around me like a heavy blanket. I had a book with me, but I found it hard to focus. I kept hearing noises, little things in the distance that I couldn't quite identify. A snap of a twig, the rustle of leaves, the distant hoot of an owl. But they didn't seem to belong to the animals I was used to hearing. These noises felt deliberate, as if something or someone was moving through the woods, just out of sight. I tried to push the thoughts aside. It was probably just the wind or an animal moving through the underbrush. But then I heard something that made my stomach drop. It was faint at first, like a whisper carried on the wind. I stood up from the fire, straining to listen. The sound was too clear to ignore now. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't an animal. It was footsteps. Someone was out there. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. I scanned the darkness, but I couldn't see anything beyond the reach of the firelight. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, maybe another camper, though I hadn't seen any other cars at the trailhead. But there was something unsettling about it, something off. The footsteps didn't sound right. They were too deliberate, too heavy, like whoever was out there was trying to be quiet but wasn't succeeding. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it toward the trees, but all I could see were shadows. The footsteps stopped, and the forest went silent again. Too silent. I stood there for a long time, just listening. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of it. What if it was someone who had followed me? What if it was someone with bad intentions? I quickly pushed those thoughts aside. I was alone, isolated. No one would just stumble upon me out here in the middle of nowhere. But the more I thought about it, the more my pulse quickened and my breath became shallow. I decided to stay by the fire, to not move, to not make a sound. If it was someone out there, I needed to be quiet, to stay hidden. But as the minutes stretched into hours, the feeling of being watched never left. I couldn't shake the sensation that someone was just beyond the edge of the firelight, waiting. I tried to sleep, but I couldn't. I lay in my tent, my mind racing, staring at the ceiling of the fabric as the wind rustled the trees outside. Every creak, every snap of a branch had me jumping. My thoughts were spiraling, each noise growing louder, each minute stretching into what felt like an eternity. I couldn't tell if I was being paranoid or if something was actually out there. Sometime in the early hours of the morning, I heard it again. The footsteps, closer this time. My heart skipped a beat. I held my breath, my mind a chaotic blur of fear and confusion. I could no longer deny it. There was someone out there, and they were getting closer. I had to make a decision. I could pack up and try to leave, but that would mean walking back to the trailhead in the dark, through the woods with whatever or whoever was out there. Or I could stay in the tent and hope they would leave. But what if they didn't? I decided to stay put. I gripped my flashlight, my hands shaking, and tried to steady my breath. I heard the footsteps again, even closer now, just outside my tent. My heart was pounding so loudly I was sure whoever was out there could hear it. Suddenly, there was a sound I didn't expect, a rustle of leaves, followed by a voice. Not a whisper, but a low murmur, like someone talking to themselves. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. Whoever it was close, very close. The minutes felt like hours, and every second that passed only increased the tension. I debated what to do, but all my thoughts kept circling back to the same question. Who was out there and what did they want? Then, in an instant, the sound stopped. The footsteps, the rustling, the murmuring. It all stopped. The forest was dead silent. I waited and waited. My body was tense, every muscle coiled, ready to spring into action. But nothing happened. No more footsteps, no more sounds. I carefully unzipped the tent, just a crack, and peered outside. The fire was still burning, casting long shadows on the ground, but there was no sign of anyone. I waited for a few more minutes, my eyes darting around the clearing. It was too quiet, too still. I didn't know what had happened, but whatever it was, it had disappeared as quickly as it had come. I waited a little longer, then finally decided to get out of the tent. I grabbed my pack, quickly and quietly, and started making my way back to the trailhead. The path felt long, the darkness felt endless, but I kept moving. My mind raced with 100 different theories, none of them comforting. As I reached the end of the trail, I could see the parking lot in the distance. The sight of my car, the sense of civilization, brought a small rush of relief. I couldn't explain what had happened out there. Maybe it was just my imagination. Maybe it was nothing at all. But I wasn't sticking around to find out. I drove away from the woods, my heart still racing, the image of the dark trees lingering in my mind. I didn't feel relief until I was miles down the road, and the woods were far behind me. And yet, even now, I can't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone out there, that whatever it was, it's still watching. I had always thought I understood the outdoors. I wasn't one of those people who would get overwhelmed by the sounds of the forest or the idea of being alone in the wilderness. I'd been camping enough times to know what to expect, or so I thought. It started off as a weekend getaway, just me and a few close friends, out in the woods for some fresh air, campfires, and a break from the usual noise of city life. We picked a spot near a secluded lake, about 3 hours from the nearest town. It was a quiet place, no hiking trails or busy campsites nearby, just trees, water, and the kind of silence that felt peaceful, almost like it could wrap around you like a blanket. The kind of place where you could get lost in your thoughts without interruption. We set up camp, each of us with our tents scattered along the edge of the lake. I made sure everything was prepared. Firewood stacked neatly, the cooler packed with food, and a small lantern to hang from one of the trees. The water of the lake was so still that it looked like a giant mirror, reflecting the sky above and the trees surrounding it in perfect symmetry. By the time the sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, we had the campfire going strong. The flames crackled and popped, throwing off sparks that disappeared into the night. I could hear the faint sounds of birds calling to each other in the distance, the gentle rustling of the leaves in the trees. Typical evening. But as the night grew darker, the atmosphere seemed to shift. There was something off. It wasn't anything obvious, but I could feel it. A subtle tension in the air, like something unseen was watching us, just beyond the reach of the firelight. I brushed it off, assuming it was just the chill in the air making me uneasy. We'd been talking and laughing around the fire, but even as the conversation continued, I could feel the unease creeping into my bones. After a while, my friends decided to turn in for the night. I had always been the last one to bed when we camped. There was something about the stillness of the night, the way the forest seemed to quiet down after dark, that I found comforting. I stayed by the fire, poking at the logs, watching the embers drift into the air. I didn't want to admit it, but the feeling of being watched kept growing stronger. Finally, when the last ember flickered out, I decided to head to my tent. I zipped up my sleeping bag, trying to push the unease to the back of my mind. The wind had picked up, gently swaying the trees around me, making the darkness outside my tent seem even more oppressive. That's when I heard it. A sound, a noise, somewhere off in the distance. It wasn't anything loud or sudden, just a low, soft rustling, like something was moving through the brush. I held my breath, listening closely. The sound stopped. Then it came again, but this time it was closer. I couldn't explain why, but it wasn't an animal. I knew that sound. It was too deliberate, too careful. I told myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer or some other creature passing through the woods. But the unease was back, stronger now. My heart rate picked up, and I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was out there, just outside my tent. I grabbed the flashlight by my side, turning it on and shining it through the thin fabric. Nothing, just the dark shadows of trees swaying in the wind. I tried to fall asleep, telling myself it was nothing. But each creak of the trees, each soft snap of a twig, made it harder to close my eyes. I lay awake for what felt like hours, hearing nothing but the faint whisper of the wind. That's when I heard something else. A voice, faint at first, almost like a whisper, but it was real. A soft murmur just beyond the reach of the trees. I froze, my blood turning cold. It wasn't one of my friends. There was no mistaking that. It was too off. The voice was low, muffled, and unnatural. I couldn't understand what it was saying, but the tone made my stomach churn. I wanted to call out, to ask if anyone else heard it, but I was too scared to move. Instead, I lay there listening, every muscle in my body tense. The voice faded away, leaving behind an eerie silence that made my skin crawl. I debated whether or not to get out of my tent and check on my friends. I knew I should, but I was too scared to leave the warmth and safety of my sleeping bag. I lay there, trying to force myself to sleep, but my mind wouldn't let go of what I had just heard. Around midnight, I finally drifted off, exhaustion taking over. But my sleep wasn't peaceful. I woke several times throughout the night, startled by every little sound, every shift in the wind. By the time morning came, I felt like I hadn't slept at all. When I stepped out of my tent, the first thing I noticed was how quiet everything was. The usual morning birdsong was missing, replaced by a strange stillness that made me uneasy. My friends were already up, standing near the fire pit, looking unnervingly quiet. I made my way over to them, trying to shake off the remnants of my uneasy night. "Hey," I said, attempting to sound casual. "Did anyone else hear anything weird last night?" They all turned to look at me, each of them with the same strange, wide-eyed expression. "Yeah," one of them said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I heard something too. Didn't want to say anything, but it sounded like someone was out there, talking." The others nodded in agreement, their faces pale. I felt a chill run down my spine. It wasn't just me, then. Whatever it was, whatever had been out there in the woods with us, it hadn't been a figment of my imagination. We spent the rest of the morning trying to shake off the weirdness. We talked about how it was probably just a trick of the wind, or perhaps some other campers in the distance. But none of us fully believed that. We all felt it. That weight in the air, that sense of being watched, that feeling that something wasn't right. By midday, we decided to pack up and leave. None of us wanted to stick around, not with the strange noises and the eerie silence hanging over the camp. We packed everything quickly, moving in silence. The hike back to the car felt longer than usual, like the woods were pressing in around us, not wanting to let us leave. The sounds of the forest, once comforting, now felt oppressive, like something was waiting for us to turn around, to look back. As we neared the edge of the woods, the tension seemed to lift. The sound of cars and distant voices reached us, and it was like we had crossed some invisible boundary. I took a deep breath, inhaling the clean, fresh air of the outside world. We were safe, but even now, as I sit here, I can't shake the feeling that we weren't alone in those woods. Whatever it wasn't a figment of our imagination. It was real. Something in those woods watching us, listening to us. And whatever it was, it didn't want us there. We never spoke about it again. We all went our separate ways, trying to put the experience behind us. But the feeling of being watched, of something lurking just beyond our sight, it never truly left me. And whenever I find myself in the woods again, no matter how calm the air may seem, I always find myself looking over my shoulder, always listening for that faint rustling sound, the one that tells me something is out there, waiting. It was supposed to be a peaceful weekend. I had taken time off from work to reconnect with nature, to escape from the constant rush of city life. I had planned everything down to the smallest detail. A simple camping trip in the woods. I was by myself, a chance to get away from the noise, the emails, the constant buzz of phones. Just me, the trees, and the open sky. The campsite was a couple of miles into the forest, far enough away from the main trail that I could get some quiet. The drive up had been uneventful, the road winding through the dense trees and occasional patches of farmland. By the time I arrived, the sun was dipping low, casting long shadows through the forest. I set up my tent without much trouble. I'd done this a dozen times before. The ground was soft, the air cool but not uncomfortable. As night approached, I started a small fire. The crackling of the wood was soothing, and the light flickered in the growing darkness. I unpacked some food and settled in for the evening, enjoying the stillness of the woods. The only sounds were the occasional rustling of leaves and the distant calls of night birds. It was peaceful, quiet, perfect, but as the night wore on, something felt off. I couldn't put my finger on it, but the air seemed to thicken with every passing minute. The fire crackled, and the shadows stretched farther than they should have. My instincts, usually so sharp in the city, felt dulled here, as if the forest was somehow watching me, waiting. I shrugged it off, telling myself that it was just the isolation playing tricks on my mind. I was alone in the wilderness, after all. That was bound to mess with anyone's head. I spent the evening cooking, eating, and trying to enjoy the stillness. But the creeping sense of being observed didn't leave. It wasn't a noise, no footsteps or twigs snapping. It was more like an absence, a weight in the air that seemed to grow as the night deepened. The moon was full, casting an eerie glow over everything, but the forest felt more alive than it should have been. Every rustle of the leaves, every shift in the wind, made me tense. I decided to turn in early. The tent was small, just enough for me to lie down and sleep. I tried to relax, listening to the sound of the fire crackling outside, but it didn't help. Sleep came in waves, each time a little shallower than the last. I woke up around midnight. There was no noise, no chirping, no rustling of animals, nothing. Just an eerie silence that filled the space outside my tent. I sat up, heart racing. The fire had burned down to embers, casting faint shadows. I could see the outline of the trees beyond, but there was no movement. Then I heard it, A soft shuffle, like something dragging across the ground. It wasn't the wind, this was something different. I froze, listening hard. The sound came again, slow and deliberate, like something or someone was walking around my camp. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I wasn't alone. I grabbed my flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness. It shook in my hand as I unzipped the tent, peering outside. The light caught the edge of the campsite, illuminating the trees. But there was nothing there, just the dark outlines of the forest, stretching endlessly into the night. I slowly stepped outside, the cool air biting at my skin. My flashlight swung across the ground, the beam bouncing off the earth and surrounding trees. Nothing. But then I noticed something that made my stomach drop. Footprints. They were small but deep, as if someone with bare feet, had walked around my tent. The prints circled the campsite, almost methodical, like they were testing the boundaries. The ground was soft from the earlier rain, and the footprints were fresh, still damp. I stood there for a moment, trying to convince myself it was just an animal. But these were human-sized prints. Small, but distinctly human. The chill in my bones spread further as I realized the tracks led into the forest. And they hadn't come from the direction of the main trail. I didn't know what to do. Should I stay and wait? Call for help? I was deep in the woods, miles away from the nearest person. The sense of being watched only intensified, and I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. I hadn't heard anything since the shuffling, but the prints were undeniable. I grabbed my backpack, quickly stuffing it with essentials. A knife, flashlight, extra food, and my phone, though I wasn't sure what good it would do out here. The last thing I wanted to do was stick around and find out who or what was leaving those tracks. I carefully made my way toward the direction of the prints, trying to stay as quiet as possible. Every crack of a branch underfoot sounded like a gunshot in the silence of the forest. My breath came in shallow gasps, and the air was thick with tension. It was so quiet that it felt unnatural. The woods, which should have been alive with the sounds of nocturnal creatures, were still. I reached the edge of the trees where the prints led. The forest opened up slightly here, a small clearing with tall grasses swaying in the breeze. But nothing seemed out of the ordinary. No movement, no sound, just the tall, looming trees and the empty clearing. I was about to turn back when something caught my eye. In the center of the clearing, partially hidden by the grass, was a small, weathered object. I walked over cautiously and knelt down to get a better look. It was a shoe, a single, dirty sneaker, half buried in the dirt. My mind raced, the connection forming before I could fully process it. A shoe, a human-sized print. Whoever had been circling my campsite, they were out here. I turned quickly, adrenaline surging. Something in my gut screamed that I needed to leave, now. But as I backed away, I heard it. A voice, not a whisper, not a shout, just a low, guttural sound that was neither human nor animal. It was close, too close. My flashlight shook in my hand as I spun around. My breath caught in my throat. But there was nothing, only the trees, the moonlight, the distant rustle of wind. Panic surged through me. I wasn't thinking anymore, just reacting. I turned and ran back toward my tent, adrenaline carrying me. My feet pounded the earth, heart thumping in my chest. I could feel the hairs on my neck standing up, as if I was being chased. I didn't look back. I couldn't afford to. I reached the tent, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the zipper. The fire had almost completely gone out now, the last embers flickering weakly. I zipped myself inside the tent, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The world outside felt so vast, so dark, and the feeling of being watched never left. I stayed there, curled up in my sleeping bag, too afraid to sleep. Every rustle of a leaf, every crack of a branch, made me jump. The night dragged on, stretching longer than it should have. I tried to remind myself that it was probably just some curious animals or someone else hiking through the woods, but deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. Whatever had been out there wasn't natural. At some point, I must have drifted into a light sleep because I woke to the sound of a branch snapping nearby. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe. I waited, listening. The silence stretched again, and for a long time, there was nothing. But then I heard it again, closer this time. Something or someone was circling the tent. I had never been a big fan of camping, but my friends had convinced me to join them on a weekend trip in the woods. I didn't know much about the area we were heading to. It was somewhere remote, far from the usual camping spots, but it was supposed to be peaceful, they said, perfect for a little escape from the noise of the city. We arrived late in the afternoon. The sun was beginning to dip behind the trees, casting long shadows that stretched across the forest floor. The air had a crispness to it, the kind of air that made your lungs feel fresh but also a little tight. There was something about it, something that felt different from other places I had been. We set up camp quickly. The tent was easy enough to pitch, and I helped gather firewood while my friends started on the campfire. As the flames crackled to life, I noticed how quiet it was. Not just the usual forest quiet. No wind, no rustling leaves, but an eerie kind of silence. There were no birds, no insects, nothing. It felt almost as though the woods were holding their breath. "Hey, what's up with the quiet? It's like everything's dead around here," I said, trying to break the stillness. One of my friends, Jake, chuckled. "Maybe it's just because it's getting late. Animals get quiet when the sun goes down." I wasn't so sure. There was a nagging feeling in the back of my mind, something I couldn't shake. I tried to ignore it, but it stuck with me throughout the evening. We sat around the fire, talking about nothing in particular, trying to enjoy the night. But as the hours passed, I couldn't help but feel like we were being watched. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see something lurking in the shadows, but every time I turned, there was nothing, just trees. Still, that feeling didn't go away. We stayed up a little later than planned, the fire eventually dying down to embers. My friends were starting to yawn, their voices getting quieter as sleepiness set in. I decided it was time to call it a night and crawled into the tent. The interior of the tent was warm, and the air smelled like damp fabric. I laid there in the dark, listening to the sounds of the forest around me. The quiet was almost unbearable now. My mind kept wandering back to the feeling I had earlier, like someone or something was out there in the dark, just beyond the reach of the firelight. I didn't sleep well that night. Every small noise, every crack of a twig or rustle in the brush made my heart race. At one point, I swear I heard footsteps outside the tent, slow and deliberate, as though someone was walking in a circle around us. I held my breath, straining to listen, but after what felt like an eternity, the noise stopped. I told myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. I don't know how long I lay there, but eventually, exhaustion took over, and I drifted into an uneasy sleep. The next morning, I woke up early, the sky still dark but starting to lighten. My friends were still asleep, so I decided to step outside for some fresh air. I zipped open the tent and stepped out into the cold morning. The world was quiet, too quiet. I stood for a moment, breathing in the cold air, the ground beneath me damp with dew. I glanced around, and that feeling returned, the feeling that we weren't alone. The forest seemed to close in on me, and I had this overwhelming urge to look behind me, but I didn't. Instead, I walked a little ways into the trees, just far enough to clear the campsite. The silence was almost oppressive, making my thoughts feel heavy. I was about to turn back when I saw something strange. There, on the ground, just outside the edge of the clearing, was a pile of broken branches. Nothing unusual about that, I thought. But then I noticed something odd. The branches were arranged in a perfect circle. I felt my stomach drop. The pile wasn't natural. It was too symmetrical, too deliberate. I stepped closer, my feet crunching on the leaves as I moved. As I reached the circle, I saw something that made my blood run cold. In the center of the circle were deep scratches, gouges in the earth that looked like they'd been made by something large, maybe an animal. But the marks weren't random. They were purposeful, like something had been trying to dig its way out. I froze. The world seemed to tilt for a moment as a rush of cold air swept through the trees, and I felt a sudden compulsion to leave. I turned quickly, heading back toward the camp, but the feeling of being watched didn't fade. It intensified, as though I had just crossed some invisible line. When I returned to the camp, my friends were stirring, starting to wake up. I didn't say anything about the strange markings I'd found. I didn't want to spook them, but I couldn't shake the unease that was creeping up my spine. As we packed up and prepared to leave, I kept scanning the trees around us. The woods seemed to be alive, and not in a good way. There was an energy in the air, thick and unsettling, and I couldn't wait to get back to the car. But as we walked down the trail, I couldn't help but glance back one last time. The woods were still, but it felt like something was waiting, something that hadn't moved since the night before. I never went camping in those woods again. It was supposed to be a peaceful camping trip, just me and the wilderness. A break from the grind, a moment of solitude. I'd been looking forward to it for weeks, planning every detail, imagining how quiet the nights would be, how refreshing the fresh air would feel on my skin. But none of that went according to plan. The day had started out beautiful, clear skies and mild temperatures. I parked my car at the trailhead, unloaded my gear, and set off on foot, carrying my backpack with everything I thought I would need. The path was familiar. I'd been to this park a couple of times before, but this time I was going deeper into the woods, farther than I'd ever gone. The forest was quiet, almost unnervingly so. Usually, you hear the chirping of birds or the rustling of animals in the underbrush, but there was none of that today. It was as though the entire forest had taken a collective breath and held it. That wasn't something I'd ever experienced before, and it sent a small chill up my spine. I pushed it aside, though. I wasn't one to let a little unease ruin a trip. I hiked on, following the narrow trail that wound deeper into the woods. The trees grew taller, their thick trunks creating a canopy that blocked out most of the sunlight. I had a map and knew the way well, but it didn't stop me from checking it every so often, making sure I was on the right path. By the time the sun began to dip behind the treeline, I had reached the small clearing where I intended to set up camp. It was isolated, a perfect spot to be alone and escape from everything. I laid out my tent, gathered some firewood, and started a fire. The warmth was a relief as the temperature started to drop. I ate a quick dinner of trail mix and jerky, then leaned back against a large rock, staring at the flames. The air was crisp, and the crackling of the fire was the only sound. I listened closely, waiting for something else, anything, to break the silence. But there was nothing. I told myself it was just a quiet night, nothing out of the ordinary. Still, there was an odd feeling creeping over me. It wasn't long before the forest seemed to shift around me. The wind began to pick up, the branches overhead groaning and creaking under the pressure. Something felt off, but I couldn't put my finger on it. I felt watched. I stood up and glanced around, scanning the trees. There was nothing, of course, just shadows and the occasional rustle of leaves. I sat back down and poked at the fire, trying to push the feeling away. It wasn't long before I decided to go to bed. The fire was starting to die down, and the wind had settled into a cold, biting chill. I crawled into my tent and zipped it up tight, trying to block out the growing unease that was creeping up my spine. The sleeping bag was warm, and I tried to relax, telling myself that everything was fine. But then I heard it. At first, it was just a faint sound, almost like a whisper carried on the wind. It was hard to make out. I paused, holding my breath, straining to listen. There it was again, a voice, but not the kind of voice you expect in the wilderness. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't the wind. It was too human. I sat up quickly, my heart hammering in my chest. The forest outside my tent was completely still. No movement.
No noise.
I waited, listening, but the voice never came again. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me, I thought. The kind of paranoia that comes when you're alone in the dark. But the silence that followed felt heavier now, more oppressive. I lay back down, trying to ignore the discomfort gnawing at me. But sleep didn't come easy. The night stretched on, and every small sound outside the tent made me tense up. The snapping of a twig, the rustle of leaves. I didn't sleep much that night. The next morning, I was up before the sun. My head felt fuzzy, the lack of sleep leaving me groggy and irritable. I quickly packed up my tent, eager to get moving. The strange feeling from the night before still lingered, and I couldn't shake the sense that I wasn't alone. I had planned to explore a bit more, but I didn't want to waste any time. I took a quick hike around the clearing, checking the area for anything unusual. But everything seemed normal, just the woods. Nothing to explain the strange voice I'd heard. Nothing that would make sense of the unease gnawing at me. I decided to cut the trip short, head back to the car. Maybe I was just tired. Maybe it was nothing more than the isolation playing tricks on my mind. The walk back was uneventful, though I still couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. My skin crawled as I quickened my pace, but I forced myself to focus on putting one foot in front of the other, pushing the thought from my mind. When I reached the trailhead, I breathed a sigh of relief. I was back to civilization. I threw my backpack in the trunk of my car and climbed into the driver's seat. But before I started the engine, I noticed something strange. There, on the ground near my car, was a footprint. Not the kind you'd expect from an animal, but from a boot. A large, human-sized print. I stood frozen, staring at it for a moment. It wasn't mine. I hadn't seen anyone else on the trail all day. A wave of nausea hit me as I looked around, but there was no sign of anyone. No movement, just the quiet of the forest. I quickly got in my car, locked the doors, and started the engine. My hands were shaking as I drove away, eyes darting from the rearview mirror to the road ahead. As I made my way back toward the nearest town, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I kept checking my rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone following me. But there was nothing. The road behind me was empty. The rest of the drive was uneventful, but I couldn't let go of the unease that had settled deep in my chest. What had happened out there? Who had left that footprint? The thought gnawed at me the entire way home, but there was nothing I could do about it now. Later that evening, when I was finally back in the safety of my apartment, I did what I should have done earlier. I called the park service just to make sure everything was fine. Maybe there had been some other hiker out there that I hadn't seen. Maybe there was a logical explanation. When I told the ranger what had happened, there was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Sir, can you describe that footprint again?" the ranger asked. I did, describing the size and shape as best I could. "Did you notice anything unusual about the area where you were camping?" the ranger asked next. "Just the silence," I replied, "and the voice I thought I heard." The ranger was quiet for a moment, then he spoke again. His voice was different now, colder. "I'll be honest with you, sir," he said. "We've had reports from others who've hiked in that area. There's been talk of someone lurking around those parts for a while. Someone who shouldn't be there." I didn't speak for a moment. A chill ran down my spine. "Lurking?" I asked, barely able to keep my voice steady. Yes, the ranger replied. We've had a few strange incidents reported by hikers and campers. People hearing voices, feeling like they're being watched. Nothing definite, but there's something off about that part of the park. We don't usually make it public because we don't want to cause a panic. But you're not the first to report something strange. I hung up the phone, my heart pounding in my chest. I had no idea what I had stumbled into, but I was certain of one thing. I wasn't going back to that park. Not ever again. I tried to tell myself that it was all just coincidence, that it was my mind playing tricks. But deep down, I knew better. There was something out there, something I had narrowly avoided, and it was better that I left when I did. The woods had their secrets, and I didn't want to know any more of them. The day had started like any other camping trip. Sunny skies, clear air, the usual sense of freedom that only comes with being in the middle of nowhere, far from the rush of daily life. My friends and I had made the usual plans. A weekend of hiking, fishing, and telling stories around the fire. The usual, but something felt different this time. I couldn't place my finger on it, but a knot in my stomach tugged at me from the moment we arrived at the campsite. We'd chosen a secluded spot deep in the woods. You know the type, surrounded by thick trees, the kind that block out most of the light, leaving just enough to see the dirt path leading to our tents. It was remote, no other campers for miles. It was perfect for what we wanted. Peace, quiet, and time away from everything. Setting up camp was routine. We set up the tents, built a fire pit, and unpacked our gear. The sun was still high, but the air was beginning to cool, that late afternoon chill that comes before dusk. Everything felt normal, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It wasn't the forest. It was just a strange sense of unease that wouldn't go away. I tried to brush it off. You're just tired, I told myself. You'll feel better once you've got a fire going and a good meal. But the feeling didn't subside. As the night began to fall and the campfire crackled to life, I couldn't help but glance around. The trees seemed to grow darker, their shadows stretching long across the ground. The air, once crisp and fresh, now felt thick, almost suffocating. My friends were too busy chatting and laughing to notice, but I felt like something was watching us. The feeling was getting stronger, and I wasn't sure why. I thought about going for a walk to clear my head, but something stopped me. I looked at the woods surrounding the camp, the deep darkness between the trees, and I felt a wave of cold wash over me. I couldn't explain it, but there was something about the way the trees stood silent, unmoving, that unsettled me. Instead, I stayed by the fire, staring into the flames, trying to ignore the discomfort creeping up my spine. The sound of laughter and the occasional pop from the fire was the only noise breaking the silence of the woods. But as the night wore on, the sounds seemed to fade. The wind had picked up, and the fire flickered in the breeze, casting long shadows across the camp. I tried to focus on the conversations, but my mind kept wandering. It was around midnight when I first heard it. At first, it was just a rustling, like the wind had picked up even more, causing the branches to sway. But the sound wasn't right. It was too rhythmic, too deliberate. I tried to convince myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer or something moving through the underbrush. But the rustling grew louder, closer. It wasn't an animal. I shifted in my seat, trying to make sense of it. My friends were still talking, oblivious to the noise, but I couldn't ignore it anymore. The sound was too close. It was moving around the edge of our camp, circling us. I glanced toward the trees, but there was nothing there. My heart began to race. I told myself to calm down. It was just a small animal, maybe a raccoon. But the rustling didn't stop. It was as if something large was moving just out of sight, following the edge of the firelight. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I tried to act casual, like everything was fine. But when I looked at my friends, they were still talking, their voices growing louder, unaware of the sound that was growing closer. I wanted to say something, to tell them, but I was frozen. I didn't want to sound crazy. I didn't want to ruin the night. I forced myself to look away from the trees and focus on the fire, but I could still hear it, slow, deliberate, like something was moving closer, circling us. The crackling of the fire seemed to get quieter. The wind began to die down, and in the stillness, the rustling grew even more distinct. It wasn't an animal. I tried to stand up, to do something, but my legs felt heavy, like I was rooted to the ground. I wasn't sure if I was just scared or if something was wrong. Maybe I was imagining it, but no matter how much I tried to rationalize it, the feeling in my gut told me something was watching us. Then, out of nowhere, a sharp, loud snap echoed through the woods, like a twig breaking underfoot. It was so close that it made me jump. The firelight flickered, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw something just beyond the trees. A figure, dark and indistinct, standing still. I froze, staring into the shadows, my heart pounding in my chest. But when I blinked, the figure was gone. I tried to breathe, to shake off the panic rising in my chest, but it wouldn't go away. I didn't want to look again, but I couldn't help myself. My eyes darted back to the tree line, but all I saw was darkness. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, something watching us. I wanted to tell my friends, to get them to leave, but I didn't want to be the one to ruin the trip. The night wore on, and eventually, one by one, my friends started heading to their tents. I stayed by the fire for a little longer, trying to convince myself that I was just being paranoid. But the feeling didn't go away. It lingered, and I couldn't ignore it any longer. As I climbed into my tent, I heard the sound again. A soft rustling, almost like a whisper, coming from just outside the flap. My breath caught in my throat. I held perfectly still, listening. It was close, too close. I could feel my pulse in my ears. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't an animal. Someone or something was out there. I've always loved camping. It was my way of escaping the chaos of daily life, a time to disconnect from everything. I'd been camping solo for years, starting as a kid, going with friends, and later on my own. It was something that always gave me peace. But this one trip, it's the one that changed my whole perspective. It was a late fall weekend when I decided to head out. The air was crisp, the kind of chilly that nips at your nose and makes your breath visible. I had the usual gear: tent, sleeping bag, stove, a few cans of beans, and a small knife I always kept on me for protection or utility. I didn't worry about being out there alone. There's something serene about the quiet of nature. But this time, something felt different. I couldn't place my finger on it. I arrived at the campsite in the afternoon, a secluded spot near a river where I'd camped a few times before. The trees were bare, and the ground was covered in thick layers of fallen leaves. It was beautiful, but the silence was heavier than usual. The river was calm, but there was a strange stillness to everything. Even the wind seemed to be holding its breath. I set up my tent by the water's edge. The trees stretched high above me, their skeletal branches casting long shadows as the sun began to dip behind the horizon. The temperature dropped rapidly, and I was glad to have packed warm clothes. As night crept in, the forest around me seemed to close in. The usual sounds of crickets and rustling leaves muted, as if something had disturbed the natural rhythm. I made a fire, the crackling flames cutting through the darkness. I didn't have any plans for the evening, just the usual routine of cooking, eating, and enjoying the peace. As I ate my beans, the shadows around me deepened, and I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. It wasn't anything obvious, just a sense of being watched. I shook it off. It was probably just the wind or an animal passing through. But the feeling didn't go away. It settled in my chest, tight and uncomfortable, like a knot I couldn't untangle. The fire flickered, casting strange shapes on the surrounding trees. A twig snapped in the distance, and I froze. My heart skipped a beat, but when I looked around, I saw nothing. I tried to laugh it off. Just the wind, I told myself. I decided to stay close to the fire, stoking it to keep the warmth and light around me. The night stretched on, and the strange feeling didn't fade. I should have gone to bed, but something kept me awake, something primal urging me to stay alert. I eventually lay down in my tent, the thin fabric doing little to keep out the cold. But sleep wouldn't come. My mind raced with thoughts of things I couldn't explain, and the feeling of being watched only grew stronger. Every time I heard the wind rustle the leaves or the distant snap of a branch, my heart would jump. I wasn't sure if it was an animal or something else. Hours passed before I finally drifted off, but even then, my sleep wasn't restful. I was haunted by the sense of something lurking just outside the light of the fire, something too close, but just out of sight. It wasn't until the next morning that I realized how deep the unease had settled in me. I woke up to the sound of birds chirping, but something about the way the sun filtered through the trees felt off. It wasn't the usual golden warmth that greeted me. It was almost as if the light was dimmer, more filtered. I shook off the feeling and started to pack up, eager to leave the campsite. But as I stood up, ready to break camp, I noticed something strange. Footprints. They were small, irregular, like a child's prints in the soft earth near my tent. But there hadn't been any children out here, and they were fresh, too fresh. I looked around, but there was no sign of anyone nearby. No sounds, no movement. I knew I should leave. There was no reason for anyone else to be out here. I kept packing, faster now, the hairs on the back of my neck prickling. My hands shook as I folded the tent. I just wanted to get out of there. The footsteps, they hadn't been there when I first arrived, and they weren't the only sign. I spotted a broken branch on the ground, snapped recently. There was a fresh trail of disturbed leaves leading off into the trees. My gut twisted. I could feel the panic creeping up on me now, the hair on my arms standing on end. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I needed to get out. With everything packed up, I started down the trail that led back to the parking area. The forest felt eerily silent as I walked, the usual sounds of birds and animals absent. It was like the woods themselves were holding their breath. The trail was familiar, but now every step felt heavier, as if the earth was pushing back against me. I kept my eyes forward, but the footsteps, they were still there. I heard them, soft, distant, but undeniably there. Something was following me, I was sure of it. The footsteps never got closer, but they never faded either. They were just there. My breath caught in my throat as I quickened my pace. Every snap of a twig or rustle in the underbrush made me jump. My heart pounded in my chest. I didn't dare look behind me. I just kept walking, faster, my legs burning with the effort. Then, in the distance, I saw it. The clearing where the trail led to the parking area. I could see my truck parked just beyond the trees. It was only a few hundred yards away, but the closer I got, the more my stomach churned. The footsteps, whoever or whatever had been following me, had stopped. I dared a glance over my shoulder, but there was nothing. No movement, no signs of life. The moment I reached my truck, I threw my gear into the back and locked the doors. I didn't waste a second. My hands fumbled as I started the engine, desperate to get away from that place. As I drove down the winding road, the uneasy feeling didn't leave me. It stayed with me, clinging to the air inside the truck like a weight. When I finally reached the nearest town, I pulled into a gas station, needing a break. I sat there for a long time, just staring out at the road. The sun had set, but the feeling of being watched didn't fade. It had followed me all the way back, deep into my thoughts. It wasn't until I stopped for gas that the weirdest thing happened. A truck pulled up next to me. The driver was a middle-aged man, his face weathered with the years. He didn't say anything at first, just filled his tank, but I saw him glance at me. There was something in his eyes, something I recognized. He leaned toward my window and asked, "You been camping up in Black Oak Ridge?" I nodded, confused. "Yeah, why?" He hesitated, glancing over his shoulder before he spoke again. "There have been reports. Strange things happening up there. People say they've seen someone or something watching them. You get that feeling?" He paused, looking at me carefully. "It's a good place to stay away from, if you can." I didn't know what to say. I was too stunned to speak. I just nodded, half-heartedly agreeing with him. It was like he knew exactly what I had felt. That eerie presence, the sensation of being followed. I didn't tell him the full story. I didn't need to. I knew he knew. As I drove away from the gas station, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, and I couldn't help but wonder, what had been out there in the woods? What had followed me that night? I had never been the type to shy away from the outdoors. Hiking, camping, and just being in nature was something I'd always found peace in. But this trip, this one was different. There was something unsettling about the forest we chose to camp in. I couldn't shake the feeling, like I was being watched, or that the trees themselves were hiding something from me. It was a feeling I couldn't explain, and the more I tried to ignore it, the stronger it became. We arrived at the campsite late in the afternoon. It had taken us hours to get there, winding down narrow, rocky roads and through thick woods, far away from any signs of civilization. The place was remote, almost too remote. As we unloaded our gear and set up the tents, the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long, eerie shadows across the forest floor. I tried to convince myself that it was just the usual camping nerves, the kind you get when you're out of your comfort zone. But as night fell, I couldn't ignore it. There was something wrong with this place. I couldn't place it at first. Was it the stillness? The absolute silence? I was used to the sounds of the forest, the rustle of leaves, the occasional chirp of a bird, the distant sound of an animal. But here there was nothing, not a single sound, just silence. It was unnerving. I tried to brush it off as my imagination running wild, but the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. We built a campfire, the warm glow of the flames flickering against the growing darkness. The fire crackled, popping every now and then as the wood burned. I sat back on a log, trying to relax, but every now and then, I'd catch movement in the trees out of the corner of my eye. When I turned my head, there was nothing there, just the dense forest, the dark outlines of the trees, and the flickering light of the campfire. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I told myself I was just being paranoid, but that didn't help. I kept scanning the trees, wondering if I'd see something, anything, that would explain why I felt so uneasy. I shifted around in my seat, glancing at the others. They seemed fine, chatting and laughing around the fire, their faces lit by the dancing flames. It was supposed to be a fun trip, a way to get away from the stress of everyday life. But as I sat there, something didn't feel right. I finally decided to call it a night. The others were still chatting, but I couldn't shake the anxiety that had settled in my chest. I crawled into my tent, zipped it up, and lay in my sleeping bag, trying to get some sleep. The silence outside my tent was deafening, and the only sound was my own breathing. I stared at the ceiling of the tent, trying to calm my racing thoughts. That's when I heard it. At first, it was faint, just a soft rustling, like something was moving through the leaves. I told myself it was just an animal, maybe a raccoon or a deer, but the sound grew louder, more distinct. It was heavy, deliberate, as if something or someone was moving closer. My heart started to race. I listened harder, trying to make sense of the noise. It wasn't the usual sounds of animals. It was too methodical, too human. I held my breath, waiting. The sound stopped, and for a moment, I thought I had imagined it. But then, just as I was starting to convince myself that I was overreacting, I heard it again. This time, it was louder, right outside my tent. My mind raced. I could feel the weight of the situation settling in. Someone or something was out there. My body was frozen, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't know what to do. Should I stay in the tent, keep quiet, and wait for whatever it was to leave? Or should I call for help? But even as I thought it, I knew there was no one nearby to help. We were completely alone out there. I waited, listening intently. The rustling continued for a few more seconds before it stopped. I strained my ears, hoping to hear something that would explain what was happening, but all I heard was silence. I lay there for what felt like hours, staring at the inside of my tent, waiting for the next sound. Eventually, sleep overcame me, but it was fitful. I woke up every few minutes, half expecting to hear the rustling again, but it never came. I couldn't help but feel a deep sense of unease as I lay there, wide awake. The next morning, I got out of the tent to find that the others had already started breakfast. They were laughing, talking, acting like everything was normal. I didn't want to tell them what I had heard last night, not because I didn't trust them, but because I didn't want to seem paranoid. So I kept it to myself. But the feeling of dread from the night before lingered. As the day went on, the weather shifted. It went from warm and clear to overcast and chilly. A soft breeze picked up, making the trees sway and creak. It was as if the forest itself had changed overnight. The woods no longer felt inviting or peaceful. They felt cold, as if they were closing in on us. But I didn't want to ruin the trip for everyone, so I kept my feelings to myself. That night, we all gathered around the campfire again, trying to shake off the strange tension in the air. The wind howled through the trees, and the fire flickered, casting long shadows that danced across the ground. As we sat there, a sudden loud crack echoed through the forest, followed by another. It sounded like something heavy had fallen, maybe a large branch, but it came from deep within the woods, far beyond where we had hiked earlier. We all fell silent, listening. The wind picked up again, and I couldn't help but feel the hairs on my neck rise. It wasn't long before we decided to turn in for the night. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, watching us. I tried to ignore it, but it was impossible to escape the sense of being trapped, as though the forest itself was closing in on us. I lay awake in my tent, every little sound making my heart race. Then I heard it again, the rustling. It was back, louder this time, closer, as if whatever had been watching us had finally made its move. I held my breath, too scared to even move. The noise stopped suddenly, and I sat there, frozen, listening. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears. The silence stretched on for what felt like hours. I finally summoned the courage to peek outside my tent. The moonlight filtered through the trees, casting eerie shadows on the ground. The campfire was just a few dying embers now, barely casting any light. The wind had stopped completely. I stepped out cautiously, my senses on high alert. That's when I saw it. A figure standing just at the edge of the firelight. It was tall, too tall and thin. At first, I thought it was one of the others, but as my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I realized it wasn't. The figure didn't move, just stood there, watching. I couldn't make out its features, but I could feel its presence, like a weight pressing down on me. I froze, my body unable to react. Then, in the blink of an eye, the figure disappeared into the trees, as if it had melted into the darkness. I stood there for a long moment, staring into the forest, waiting for it to come back, but it never did. My mind raced, What had I seen? Was it real? Maybe it was just my imagination running wild again. But something told me it wasn't. Whatever I had seen, it was real. I wasn't going crazy. I couldn't go back to sleep after that. I stayed up for the rest of the night, sitting by the dying campfire, watching the trees. The others never woke up, and when the sun finally rose, I packed up my things without saying a word to anyone. I couldn't stay another night in that forest. Something was wrong there, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. As we left, I took one last look at the woods, hoping to find some explanation for the strange events of the past few days. But there was nothing. The trees stood silent, as if nothing had happened at all. Even now, as I tell this story, I can't explain what happened. It wasn't a ghost or a creature from some old legend. It was just something that didn't belong there, something that I will never forget. I don't know if it was a warning or just a strange coincidence, but I will never set foot in that forest again. The memories of that trip still haunt me, and every time I see the woods, I can't shake the feeling that something is out there, waiting, watching, just beyond the trees. It was meant to be a peaceful weekend escape, a break from the constant noise of city life, away from the screens and the chaos of work. I had always found solace in nature. There was something grounding about the simplicity of it. The cool mountain air, the rustling trees, the sound of a nearby stream. I didn't want to spend another weekend cooped up indoors. So, I packed up my gear, loaded my truck with everything I needed, and made the drive to a secluded campground, far from the bustle of people. I arrived late in the afternoon. The sun was just beginning to dip behind the ridge, casting long shadows over the forest. The campground was tucked away in a narrow valley, a place I had visited once before but hadn't returned to in a few years. There were only a few other campsites, spread out enough that I wouldn't have to worry about loud neighbors or too much disturbance. It seemed like the perfect spot for solitude. I set up my tent near a small clearing, just off a trail that led deeper into the woods. The sound of crickets and birds filled the air. I made a fire pit, got a fire going, and prepared my dinner, a simple meal, just a few sandwiches and some fruit. As I sat on a log, eating and watching the fire, the forest seemed so peaceful, so calm. It felt like the perfect way to unwind. After dinner, I sat for a while, letting the flames crackle and the night settle around me. The temperature dropped quickly as the sun disappeared completely, and the darkness became all-encompassing. It wasn't unnerving, though. I had been camping in the wilderness before. I knew how to handle the isolation, how to keep myself grounded. The only sounds now were the occasional snap of a twig in the distance and the wind whistling through the trees. I had just finished cleaning up when I noticed something odd, a shape in the distance between the trees. It was hard to make out, but it looked like something moving just at the edge of the firelight. I stood still, eyes narrowing, trying to make sense of it. At first, I thought it might be a deer or some other animal, but it didn't seem to move like one. It was almost too deliberate, too human. I convinced myself I was just imagining things. It was getting late, and I was probably just tired. I dismissed the thought and went about setting up my sleeping bag inside the tent. But even as I crawled in, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I lay there, eyes wide open in the darkness of the tent, listening to the rustle of the wind outside and the distant calls of animals. The feeling of being watched lingered, and I couldn't tell if it was real or just my mind playing tricks on me. Hours passed. I tried to sleep, but the uneasy sensation didn't fade. Finally, I decided to step outside, thinking that maybe a breath of fresh air would help clear my head. I grabbed a flashlight, unzipped the tent, and stepped out into the cool night. The forest was quiet, eerily so. The moon had risen higher, casting pale light through the canopy of trees. The fire had burned down to embers, and the camp was surrounded by shadows. I stood there for a moment, scanning the trees. There was nothing out of place. No movement, no shapes. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling. My gut was telling me something was wrong. Maybe it was the isolation, or maybe it was just the fact that I hadn't been camping alone for a while. I told myself it was nothing, that I was just being paranoid. I wasn't sure what I expected to find, but I was certain something had been watching me earlier. I turned around and went back inside the tent, feeling a little foolish for stepping out. I tried to shake the feeling, telling myself it was just my imagination. Still, I couldn't sleep. Every little noise outside seemed amplified in the silence. I kept my flashlight by my side, hoping it would offer some comfort if anything happened. It wasn't until a little past midnight when I heard it. A faint sound, a footstep followed by another. Soft, deliberate, as if someone who wasn't supposed to be there was walking just outside my tent. I froze, heart pounding in my chest. My breath caught in my throat, and I held perfectly still, straining to listen. The footsteps stopped. I waited, holding my breath. Had I imagined it, or was someone really out there? I grabbed the flashlight, my hands shaking, and slowly unzipped the tent just enough to peek outside. The beam of the flashlight cut through the darkness. For a moment, there was nothing. The camp was empty, just the quiet crackling of the fire. I stepped out cautiously, my senses on high alert. That's when I saw it. A figure, tall and thin, standing just beyond the glow of the fire. They were still watching me, their face hidden in the shadows. I froze, my mind racing. Was it another camper? A ranger? But no, I hadn't seen any other cars at the site when I arrived, and there were no other tents in sight. The figure didn't move. I couldn't make out any details about them, just a silhouette against the trees. I stood there, unsure of what to do. Should I approach them? Call out? Or should I get inside my tent and lock the zipper shut? Before I could decide, the figure took a slow step forward, and my instincts kicked in. I backed away, nearly stumbling over a rock in my haste to retreat. I darted back toward the tent, not daring to take my eyes off the figure. My heart was racing in my chest, and I could feel panic rising within me. I reached the tent and zipped it up in a hurry, locking the flap tight. My mind was whirling. What had I just seen? Who was that person, and why were they out here in the woods in the middle of the night? I didn't dare sleep. I lay awake, listening to every creak and snap in the woods. The feeling of being watched was stronger now. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, that I had overreacted, but deep down, I knew something was wrong. The hours crawled by. Eventually, I must have dozed off because the next thing I knew, I woke with a start. My flashlight was still in my hand, but the sun was beginning to rise, casting a pale light into the tent. For a moment, I thought it had all been a dream, a nightmare fueled by too much solitude. But when I unzipped the tent and stepped outside, I saw something that made my stomach turn. The fire pit was undisturbed, but the area around it was different. Footprints, large, heavy prints, had appeared overnight, leading in circles around my campsite. They were fresh, and they were too large to belong to an animal. The prints were too deliberate, too human. I stood there, staring at the tracks, feeling a cold chill run down my spine. Whoever had been watching me the night before had been here. They had circled my camp while I slept. I didn't waste any more time. I packed up my things quickly, my hands trembling as I stuffed everything back into the truck. The feeling of unease had intensified, and I couldn't shake the thought that someone or something was out there, watching me. By the time I was done packing, the sun was fully up. I got into my truck, started the engine, and drove away without looking back. The campground, once so peaceful, now felt like a distant memory, one I hoped I'd never have to return to. The drive back to the city felt long, but the further I went, the lighter I felt. The air seemed easier to breathe, and the weight on my chest lifted. I couldn't explain what had happened in those woods, but I knew one thing for certain. I would never camp alone in that spot again. The unsettling feeling lingered for days. I kept checking the news, hoping I hadn't missed some story about a dangerous person in the area, but there was nothing. No mention of anyone going missing or being found. No reports of strange behavior or incidents. It was as if that night had never happened at all. But I knew better. I knew something had been out there, and it was still watching me even now. It was meant to be just another camping trip. One of those weekends where you pack up, head into the woods, and leave behind the noise of the city for a few days. Just me, my tent, and the comforting hum of the forest. The idea of a peaceful retreat in nature always felt like the perfect way to unwind. But I never imagined how quickly that sense of tranquility would crumble. I'd chosen this particular spot because it was a place I had visited before. A secluded area deep in the woods, tucked away from the usual hiking trails. I liked the solitude. My previous trips here had been uneventful, peaceful even. No other campers nearby, just the sounds of birds, the rustling of leaves, and the occasional snap of a twig underfoot. Simple, clean, quiet. The hike in was a little tougher than I remembered. I had packed light with just a sleeping bag, a small tent, some food, and a bottle of water. Still, the uneven ground and thick underbrush made me wish I had taken the time to plan better. But the challenge was part of the appeal. After about an hour of walking, I reached the small clearing I had in mind, where the trees opened up just enough to set up camp. The sun was starting to dip below the horizon when I began setting up the tent. The air had that crisp feeling to it, signaling the start of the evening chill. I worked quickly, hammering in the stakes and securing the ropes. As the last stake went in, I stepped back and admired the little camp I had made. The tent was snug, tucked between two large oaks, with the remnants of a once-flowing creek nearby. I unpacked my things and gathered some dry wood to make a fire. I wasn't expecting a long night. I planned to cook a quick meal, enjoy the crackling warmth of the fire, and fall asleep early. The whole point of this trip was to disconnect and get some rest, to not worry about the hustle of life or the weight of daily obligations. The fire crackled to life after a few minutes of fussing with kindling. It wasn't big, just enough to ward off the cold. I sat close to it, eating some trail mix and staring into the flames, listening to the occasional rustling of leaves or the distant call of a bird. My mind wandered, relaxing in the peace of the evening. As the sky darkened, the forest began to take on a different atmosphere. The chirping insects grew louder, and the trees swayed in the wind. The shadows stretched long and eerie, especially around the edges of the clearing. Despite the calm, something about the silence felt off. I couldn't place it at first. Maybe it was just the isolation, the way the wind sounded through the branches, or maybe it was the absence of any other campers. The night deepened. My fire began to die down, and I stoked it, watching the flames grow higher. That's when I heard it. At first, I thought it was just an animal moving through the brush, maybe a deer or a raccoon. But the noise was different. A subtle crunch, like something heavy was moving through the undergrowth, but without the usual rustle of leaves. It was too deliberate, too controlled. I froze. I wasn't alone. My breath caught in my chest. I couldn't see anything through the darkness beyond the firelight, but the noise had stopped. My heart pounded in my ears, louder than the wind in the trees. For a few long moments, I sat there, straining to hear anything that might explain the disturbance. The quiet stretched, but the sound didn't return. I told myself it was nothing, just a raccoon or maybe the wind playing tricks. But the feeling didn't leave me. I decided to call it a night. The fire was barely a few glowing embers now, and the cold air nipped at my skin. I gathered what little energy I had left, crawled into the tent, and zipped myself in. The small space felt tight, comforting in its own way, but also isolating. The night was far darker now, the only light coming from a faint moon that barely pierced through the canopy. The sounds of the forest outside became muffled, like the night had swallowed them whole. My thoughts turned to sleep, but my mind kept replaying the strange noise I had heard earlier. It kept me restless, tossing and turning on the thin sleeping pad. Every slight sound made my body tense. I told myself it was nothing, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was out there. At some point, I drifted off into a light, uneasy sleep. The hours passed slowly, but eventually, I awoke with a start. A loud crack echoed through the night. A branch snapped somewhere near the edge of the clearing. I sat up immediately, my heart pounding once more. I grabbed my flashlight and shined it toward the tent flap, but I saw nothing. The forest was completely still again. I lay back down, trying to breathe evenly, but the tension was suffocating. Felt like the air was thicker now, pressing in on me. There was something out there, something watching. Maybe it was just my imagination. Maybe, but that didn't explain the feeling in the pit of my stomach. The growing sense that I wasn't alone. That someone or something was waiting, watching. I glanced at the entrance of my tent, half expecting to see a figure standing just outside. But there was nothing. Still, I couldn't shake the sensation that the woods themselves were alive with hidden eyes. I pulled the sleeping bag tightly around me and lay there, wide awake, listening. The wind picked up again, rustling the leaves in a familiar, almost comforting way. But that comfort quickly turned to unease when the snapping sounds returned. Closer now. Someone or something was definitely moving through the forest. It wasn't an animal. The sounds were too rhythmic, too deliberate. I had to know what it was. Slowly, I unzipped the tent just enough to poke my head out. The flashlight in my hand trembled slightly as I swept it across the clearing. The beam illuminated the trees around me, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch unnaturally. I looked past the fire pit into the blackness beyond. There was nothing, no movement, no figure, only the dark shapes of trees swaying gently in the wind. Still, the unsettling feeling didn't leave me. I kept the flashlight close, shining it in every direction, but everything remained still. For a moment, I considered packing up and leaving. The thought of walking through those woods in the middle of the night, alone and vulnerable, was terrifying. But I had no choice. I couldn't stay here, not with whatever was out there, not with that feeling gnawing at the back of my mind. I grabbed my things, rushed to pack them up as quietly as possible, but as I bent down to grab my bag, I heard it again. This time, it wasn't just a snap. It was a deep, heavy footstep, almost like a person walking, deliberately slow, circling the clearing. I froze. My body went cold. The flashlight slipped from my grip and rolled away, the beam dancing wildly on the forest floor before settling on the trees. I felt the blood drain from my face. In the dark, just beyond the reach of the firelight, I saw something, a shape, tall, human-like, but it wasn't moving the way a person should. It wasn't walking. It was pacing, slowly back and forth just outside the light. The figure seemed to blend into the shadows, too tall and too still to be natural. I didn't know what to do. The logical part of my mind told me to stay calm, to think clearly, but panic gripped me. My hands shook, and my breath came in short gasps. I grabbed my stuff, now completely in survival mode. I unzipped the tent fully and, with everything I could carry, ran into the woods. The sounds of branches breaking and footsteps following me made my heart race faster. Every instinct screamed at me to run. I didn't dare look back. I just ran. I ran until my legs felt like jelly, until I couldn't breathe, until the exhaustion almost overtook me. When I finally stopped, panting, and glanced around, I realized I had no idea where I was. I had no sense of direction in the dark. I could barely make out the trees around me. I sat against a trunk, trying to calm my breathing. I wasn't sure how much time had passed, but it felt like forever. The only sound was my own shallow breath and the rustle of leaves. Eventually, I heard nothing.
No footsteps. No cracking branches.
Only the wind, but the fear lingered. I had no idea what that figure had been. The woods around me felt suffocating now, as though the trees themselves were watching. Hours later, as the first light of dawn filtered through the trees, I managed to find my way back to the road. It was a long walk, but I had no other choice. When I finally reached my car, I didn't even hesitate. I got in, started the engine, and drove as far as I could until the woods faded from view. I never went back, but every now and then, I think about what I saw out there in the dark, and I wonder if it was something real or just a trick of the mind. I've always been the type to love the outdoors. The smell of fresh pine, the crackling of the fire under a dark sky full of stars, the sense of quiet that comes with being miles away from the nearest neighbor. There's something grounding about it all. So, when my friends and I decided to go on a camping trip in the middle of nowhere, I didn't hesitate for a second. We had planned it for weeks, picking out the perfect spot on the map, a secluded patch of land near a creek in a small forest. The idea was to spend a few days away from the noise of the world, to disconnect, and just enjoy the simplicity of nature. But the closer we got to the site, the more I felt a sense of unease that I couldn't shake off. It was an odd feeling, but nothing that stood out enough to make me second-guess the trip. The drive was long. The roads got narrower the further we went, and soon they were little more than dirt paths barely wide enough for our truck. The trees closed in on either side, their branches like twisted hands reaching out to trap us. But still, I pressed forward. We all did. I tried to ignore the strange tightening in my chest. When we finally arrived, the sun was just beginning to set, casting long shadows across the forest floor. The campsite was perfect, secluded, peaceful, surrounded by tall trees that seemed to stand guard over us. We unloaded the truck, set up our tents, and started gathering wood for the fire. As the flames flickered to life, I felt the weight of the day start to melt away. But there was something strange about the quiet. Normally, when you're in the woods, you hear the rustling of animals, the chirping of birds, the occasional crack of a branch underfoot. But tonight it was dead silent. No animals, no wind, just the fire crackling in the distance and the occasional rustle of the trees. At first, I thought I was just imagining it. Maybe it was the altitude, maybe the time of year. But as I sat there staring into the flames, I couldn't help but feel that something wasn't right. I couldn't put my finger on it, but the air seemed thick, charged with an invisible tension. After a while, we settled into the routine of camping. We ate, drank, and talked, but I couldn't shake that uneasy feeling. It didn't help that the others didn't seem to notice it, laughing and joking like everything was perfectly normal. I tried to ignore the feeling, telling myself it was just the unfamiliarity of being so deep in the woods. But as the night wore on, it became harder and harder to push the sense of dread down. The fire was burning low when we decided to head to bed. It was pitch black outside, the only light coming from the dim glow of the embers. I crawled into my tent, zipped myself up, and tried to fall asleep, but I couldn't. There was something about the stillness outside, something in the air that kept me awake. It wasn't until well past midnight that I finally drifted off. But even in my sleep, I could sense that something wasn't quite right. I woke up to a sound that cut through the silence like a knife. A loud, piercing crack, followed by the distinct rustle of leaves, almost like something large was moving through the forest. My heart raced, and I held my breath, straining my ears to catch any other noise. But the sound stopped as quickly as it had started. I lay there, wide-eyed in the dark, listening. The air was thick with the smell of pine and earth, but now there was something else. A faint odor that was almost sour, like something had been rotting. I wasn't sure what it was, but it made my stomach turn. I told myself it was just a deer or some other animal moving through the brush. After all, animals were always active at night. But the longer I lay there, the more I felt the weight of something watching me, something that didn't belong in the forest. I tried to ignore it, telling myself that my mind was just playing tricks on me. But the sensation only grew stronger. It was like there was something outside my tent, just beyond the flap, waiting. My breath came in shallow gasps as I pulled the sleeping bag tighter around me. I knew I had to get up, check outside, but the thought of unzipping the tent and stepping out into the dark forest was terrifying. I had no reason to be afraid, no reason at all. But the longer I lay there, the more it felt like the forest itself was closing in on me. Eventually, my nerves got the better of me, and I crawled out of my sleeping bag, slowly unzipping the tent door. I stuck my head out, scanning the shadows, but there was nothing, just the silent, still woods. I listened again, hoping to hear the faint rustling of a small animal, but there was only silence, the kind of silence that made my skin crawl. I stepped outside, wrapping my arms around myself against the chill of the night air. The fire had burned out completely, and in the blackness, it felt like the world had swallowed us whole. I walked a few paces away from the tents, trying to shake off the unease, but that's when I saw it. In the distance, just past the tree line, there was something large moving through the shadows. I froze, staring, my heart hammering in my chest. It wasn't an animal. It was too tall, too deliberate. The figure moved slowly, deliberately, as if it knew I was watching. My breath caught in my throat. I tried to convince myself it was just a trick of the light, a shadow cast by a tree or a branch. But the movement was too fluid, too unnatural. I backed up slowly, inching toward the tent, my eyes never leaving the figure. It didn't make a sound. Not a single twig snapped beneath its feet. It just moved, like a predator stalking its prey. I stumbled backward into the tent, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the zipper. I barely managed to get it closed before I collapsed onto my sleeping bag, gasping for air. My mind raced, trying to process what I had seen, but no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't explain it. I wasn't imagining things. The night stretched on, but sleep was impossible. I lay awake, my senses on high alert, listening for any sign that whatever it was had followed me back to the campsite. But the night remained eerily quiet, the only sound the occasional rustle of the trees. When morning finally came, the sun rose over the trees, casting a warm glow over the campsite. I felt a strange sense of relief, but also guilt. Had I overreacted? Was it all just my imagination? I didn't want to worry the others, so I kept what I saw to myself. We packed up the campsite, made breakfast, and started discussing plans for a hike. The unease from the night before still lingered, but I pushed it down. However, as we started to walk deeper into the forest, I began to notice something. The trees were oddly spaced, like they had been deliberately placed. There were no signs of wildlife, no birds, no squirrels, no rustling in the underbrush. Felt like the forest was too quiet. And then I saw something else. Footprints. Large, human-sized footprints in the soft earth, leading off the trail and deeper into the woods. They were fresh, too fresh to have been there long. And they weren't our footprints. I showed the others, but they brushed it off, suggesting that maybe someone else had been in the area recently. But I knew what I had seen the night before. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. We finished the hike, but the rest of the trip felt off. The quiet was suffocating, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. When we finally left the woods, I felt like I could breathe again. I don't know what it was that I saw that night. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But after that trip, I've never gone camping in that area again. And to this day, I can't shake the feeling that whatever it was out there is still watching, waiting. I've been planning this camping trip for weeks. The moment the weather forecast predicted a stretch of clear skies and cool evenings, I packed my gear and told my friends I was heading out to a quiet spot in the woods. They all thought I was nuts, said the place was too isolated, too far from the nearest town, and a little sketchy. But I liked it that way. I wanted to get away from everything. The noise, the constant buzz of phones, the pressure of life. Just me, my tent, the forest, and my thoughts. The location was a small, off-the-grid campsite in a national forest. I found it by digging through old online forums where people talked about remote camping spots. It was tucked away, not marked on regular maps, and the road leading to it barely even counted as a road. That's why most people didn't go there. The hike was long, and the path was rough, perfect for someone like me who wanted peace and solitude. I figured I'd hike out to the site, set up my tent, and spend the next couple of days relaxing, fishing, and just breathing in the fresh air. The drive to the trailhead was long, too, and I had to make sure I had enough fuel and supplies. I didn't want to be stuck in the middle of nowhere without the essentials. The forest was thick with trees, the kind that look ancient, like they've been standing there for centuries, quietly observing everything around them. The drive alone was eerie in a way, but it was the kind of eerie I found comforting. The kind that made you feel small yet alive in the grand scheme of things. By the time I reached the trailhead, it was already late afternoon. I parked my car, double-checked my pack, and set off down the overgrown path with nothing but the sound of my boots crunching on the dirt and the occasional rustling of wildlife around me. The forest was dense, trees everywhere, their long branches creating a canopy that blocked out most of the sky. A few birds chirped, and once in a while, I'd hear a twig snap or see a squirrel dart across the trail. There was a slight chill in the air, but it was refreshing, especially after the warm drive. As the hike went on, I could feel the isolation sinking in. The deeper I went, the less I saw of the outside world. No more roads, no more signs of civilization, just the forest. And it was quiet, too quiet. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It wasn't anything specific, just the overwhelming silence that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. But I shrugged it off. I'd hiked alone before. This was just the woods doing what the woods do. I'd estimated the hike would take about 2 hours, but by the time I reached the campsite, the sun was already dipping low, casting long shadows across the trail. The campsite itself was tucked away in a small clearing, surrounded by a thick circle of trees. There was a fire ring, some old, weathered logs around it, and a perfect flat spot for a tent. A small stream ran a little ways off to the side, its gurgling water creating a soft background noise. I set up my tent quickly, not wanting to mess around too much with the fading light. The forest was getting darker faster than I expected, and I knew it wouldn't be long before the night fully settled in. I built a small fire, careful not to let it get too big since it was already a dry season, and sat down to enjoy the peace. The first night was exactly what I wanted. Quiet, tranquil, and solitary. The fire crackled, the stars blinked overhead, and all I could hear was the rustle of leaves in the cool breeze. I ate some pre-packed food, watched the flames dance, and listened to the sound of the stream in the distance. It was perfect. I felt a kind of peace I hadn't felt in a long time. The kind of peace that makes you forget the chaos of the outside world. But that peace didn't last long. Around midnight, I woke up to a noise. It wasn't the usual sounds of nature that filled the air at night. The chirping of crickets, the rustling of leaves, the occasional hoot of an owl. This was something else, something out of place. A thud, a heavy thud, like something big hitting the ground, followed by a scrape against the earth, as if something had been dragged. I froze in my sleeping bag, my mind racing. Was it an animal? A bear? Maybe. I had heard stories of them wandering into campsites, but the sound didn't fit that. Bears are loud. They crash through the underbrush, making a lot of noise when they move. This was quiet, too quiet. I held my breath and listened. Another thud, closer this time, and then the scrape again. It was coming from the other side of the camp, behind the trees near the fire ring. My heart started pounding in my chest. I couldn't explain it, but I knew something wasn't right. The forest felt different now, as if it had shifted into a darker version of itself. The usual night sounds had stopped entirely. No wind, no rustling leaves, just silence. I slowly unzipped my sleeping bag, trying not to make a sound, and grabbed the flashlight from the side of my pack. My hand trembled as I turned it on, the beam cutting through the darkness in front of me. I crept to the tent opening, trying to peer outside without revealing myself. My pulse was deafening in my ears, and every breath I took felt too loud. I didn't see anything, but the thudding continued, this time closer to the tent. I wanted to call out, but the sound of my voice felt like it would be a mistake, like it would somehow make the situation worse. Instead, I stayed still, holding my breath. The flashlight's beam shook as I slowly scanned the trees around me. Then I saw it, a figure, a shadow in the distance, just past the fire ring, half hidden behind a tree. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't a person either. It was a shape, dark and moving in a way that didn't seem right, too fluid, too deliberate. It was as if the shadow was aware of me, of where I was. I couldn't explain how I knew, but I did. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't natural. I blinked and the figure was gone, just like that, swallowed up by the forest. I was shaking now, my mind spinning. Maybe it was just my nerves. I hadn't seen it clearly. Maybe it was just a trick of the light or a raccoon or something else that moved strangely. But the feeling of being watched didn't go away. It only grew stronger. I sat in silence for what felt like hours, too scared to move, too scared to make a sound. The thudding had stopped, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still out there, waiting. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the noise stopped completely. The forest seemed to breathe again, and I could hear the night sounds returning. The rustling of the leaves, the wind picking up, the faint sound of the stream. I didn't sleep much that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that figure, dark and fleeting, always just out of reach. The next morning, I was exhausted. The sun was up, and everything seemed normal again. Birds were chirping, the air was fresh, and the woods felt peaceful once more. I tried to brush off what had happened the night before, telling myself I had imagined it. Maybe it was an animal. Maybe I was just spooked by the isolation. I spent the day fishing by the stream and exploring the nearby woods. I didn't see anything unusual, and by the time evening came, I had almost convinced myself it was nothing. I set up my camp again, made another small fire, and cooked a simple dinner. I even laughed at myself for getting so worked up. The forest was beautiful. There was no reason to be afraid. That night, however, something else happened. I woke up to a sound again, this time closer. A soft, slow dragging noise. And then the unmistakable sound of something breathing. I froze, my blood turning cold. The breath was too loud, too close. It wasn't human. It was something else. Something big. Something that wasn't supposed to be there. I stayed completely still, barely breathing, until the sound faded away. I didn't dare move for the rest of the night. When the sun came up the next morning, I packed my things quickly, left the campsite, and didn't look back. I didn't care if I didn't finish my trip. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone in those woods. As I walked back to my car, I could feel the weight of the silence behind me, and I knew one thing for sure. There was something out there, something in those woods that I would never understand, and I was never going back. I'd been looking forward to this trip for weeks, a weekend alone in the wilderness. No distractions, no phones, just me and nature. A break from everything. I packed my tent, some cans of beans, water, and a few basic camping tools. The weather forecast had been good, promising clear skies and mild temperatures. My plan was simple: hike to a secluded spot by a lake, set up camp, and spend a couple of nights enjoying the peace and quiet. The hike was about 5 miles deep into the woods, and it took me roughly 2 hours to get there. I was exhausted by the time I arrived, but the serenity of the place made up for the effort. The sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows across the ground. The lake was still, reflecting the orange hues of the setting sun like a perfect mirror. I found a spot by the water's edge to set up my tent. It wasn't as close to the lake as I would have liked, but it was sheltered enough by the trees to give me some cover from the wind. The forest around me was dense, the trees standing like silent sentinels, their branches swaying gently in the evening breeze. After getting my camp set up, I started a small fire. The sound of crackling wood was the only thing that broke the silence of the woods. I sat by the fire for a while, eating the beans I had packed and thinking about the things I'd left behind. My life had felt chaotic recently. Work was stressful, relationships were strained, and I needed to get away. I had hoped that this weekend would give me the clarity I was searching for. As the fire burned low, I lay back in my tent, listening to the night sounds. The chirping of crickets, the occasional hoot of an owl, the rustling of leaves in the breeze. The forest was alive, but in a way that felt comforting. After a long day of hiking, I was too tired to stay awake for long. I pulled my sleeping bag around me, closed my eyes, and drifted off. I woke up to a strange noise in the middle of the night. At first, I thought it was the wind, but then I realized it was something different. A faint thud, like something heavy hitting the ground. My heart rate quickened. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, just an animal, but there was something unsettling about it. The sound came again, followed by a scraping noise, as if something large was moving across the ground. I held my breath, straining to listen. The sound was coming from the woods, just beyond the edge of my camp. It wasn't the usual rustling of small animals, nor the wind sweeping through the trees. It was deliberate, slow. It felt like whatever was making that noise was pacing, moving in a way that was too controlled to be natural. I grabbed my flashlight and poked my head out of the tent, scanning the dark forest. There was nothing, just shadows, trees, and the flickering light of my dying fire. My mind raced, thinking of all the wild animals that lived out here. Bears, wolves, and even mountain lions. Maybe it was a bear sniffing around, curious about the food. But the thought of a bear moving like that didn't sit right with me. I'd seen bears before, and they were usually much more unpredictable in their movements. I decided to wait, hoping whatever it was would move on. But then I heard it again. The thud, the scrape. This time it was closer, much closer. I could feel my pulse in my throat. My first instinct was to pack up and leave, but something kept me frozen in place. I couldn't explain it. This eerie, gut-deep feeling that I was being watched. I looked around again, but the woods were still dark and quiet. There was no sign of movement, no indication of what had been making those noises. Minutes passed, and eventually the sounds stopped. My body was stiff with tension, but I forced myself to lie down again, trying to convince myself it was just an animal. That was the most logical explanation, right? Still, sleep didn't come easily. I lay there, wide-eyed, listening to the sounds of the forest around me. But now the noises were different. The crickets had quieted, and I could hear the sound of something breathing. At that point, I was fully awake, my senses on high alert. I reached for the flashlight again and shone it out of the tent. Nothing, but the sound of breathing was unmistakable. It was slow and steady, almost like someone or something was lying just outside my tent, taking deep, deliberate breaths. I felt my blood run cold. There was no way this could be just an animal. I waited, frozen, for what felt like an eternity. I couldn't see anything. There was no movement in the trees, no rustling in the underbrush. Yet the breathing continued. I tried to steady my nerves, but my mind was racing, trying to figure out what was going on. Was someone out there? Was I being stalked by a person? A hunter? Or maybe I was just losing my mind. Then, just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, the breathing stopped. Silence felt so heavy, like the world had been frozen in time. I waited, listening for any hint of a sound, but there was nothing. The wind had died down, and all I could hear was the faint crackling of the dying fire. I lay there, not daring to move, my heart pounding in my chest. Couldn't go to sleep. Couldn't even close my eyes. Whatever was out there, it hadn't gone far. I had to figure out what was going on. Slowly, I crawled out of the tent, trying to make as little noise as possible. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing the shadows of the trees and the faint glint of the lake in the distance. I scanned the area, but there was no sign of anything unusual. Nothing. No footprints, no signs of movement. But then, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Just at the edge of the woods, about 20 feet away, there was a figure standing in the dark. It was tall and thin, barely visible in the shadows, but I could make out the outline of its head, its shoulders. I could feel my body freeze in place. I thought for a moment I was seeing things, but then the figure shifted slightly, almost imperceptibly, as if it had noticed my gaze. I didn't know what to do. I felt a surge of panic, but at the same time, a strange, almost paralyzing sense of dread kept me rooted to the spot. I wanted to run, but my legs felt heavy, as though the earth itself was holding me in place. I knew I had to act quickly. My only option was to go back to the tent, to grab my stuff, and get the hell out of there before whatever it was had a chance to come any closer. I started to back away slowly, not wanting to make any sudden movements. But then, just as I was about to turn and make a run for it, I heard a voice. It wasn't loud, but it was clear enough for me to hear it through the silence. It was a whisper, so soft I almost missed it. "Help me." The words sent a jolt of electricity through my body. My heart raced, my mind spinning, trying to make sense of what was happening. Was someone in trouble out there? Was it someone who had gotten lost in the woods? But if that was the case, why hadn't I heard any cries for help earlier? I couldn't stay out there any longer. My fear took over, and I turned and ran back to my tent. My breath was coming in ragged gasps as I scrambled to pack up my things. The forest, once so peaceful, now felt suffocating, like the trees themselves were closing in on me. I didn't waste any time. I threw everything into my backpack, ignoring the nagging voice in my head that kept telling me I needed to check the woods one last time. I had to get out of there. The idea of spending one more minute in that place was unbearable. I packed everything into my car and sped away as fast as I could, not daring to look back. When I got home, I felt a strange sense of relief wash over me. The city was noisy, full of people, and I should have felt overwhelmed, but instead, it was comforting, safe. I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened out there, though. The breathing, the figure in the woods, the whisper. I don't know what I saw that night. I don't know who or what it was, but I do know that I never went back to that lake. Couldn't. The memory of that whisper, of that eerie presence in the dark, still haunts me. I don't even want to think about it anymore, but I can't help but wonder what was out there and what did it want. The trip was supposed to be a break from the grind, just me, the woods, and the quiet. I planned it for weeks, a few days in the remote wilderness of the Cascades, where the air smells like pine and dirt, and the only sounds are the ones you make yourself. I'd packed everything carefully: tent, sleeping bag, water filter, stove, plenty of food, a good knife, and a map of the area. No GPS, no cell service. That was the whole point. The trailhead was nearly empty when I pulled in. It was mid-October, and the air had that crisp, biting quality that told you winter wasn't far off. I adjusted my pack, checked my map one last time, and set off. The first few hours were perfect. The trail wound up through thick forest, the kind where the sunlight barely filters through, and every step kicked up the earthy scent of fallen leaves and damp soil. The world seemed muted, like the trees were absorbing every sound but my own breathing and the crunch of my boots. By late afternoon, I'd reached the ridge I'd been aiming for. It overlooked a small, secluded valley with a stream cutting through it. The view was breathtaking, the kind of scene you'd find on a postcard. I found a flat spot near the treeline, set up my tent, and gathered wood for a small fire. The sun dipped lower, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink before finally giving way to the cold blue of twilight. I ate dinner by the fire, just a simple freeze-dried meal, but it tasted amazing after the day's hike. The stars came out in full force, brighter and more numerous than I'd seen in years. I stayed up longer than I should have, staring at them, letting the quiet seep into my bones. Eventually, the cold drove me into my tent. I zipped myself into my sleeping bag, listened to the faint rustle of the wind through the trees, and drifted off. I woke up to a sound. It was subtle, just outside the range of what you'd call noise. At first, I thought it was the wind again, but it was too deliberate. A snapping twig, then silence. My body went rigid. I strained my ears, holding my breath. Another sound, a soft thud, like a footstep on damp ground. It was close, too close. I've camped enough to know the difference between an animal and a person. Animals move erratically. They scurry, they sniff, they're bold in their movements. This was none of that. This was deliberate, cautious, like someone was trying not to be heard. My mind raced. Could it be another camper? But I hadn't seen anyone all day, and this spot was far off the main trail. People didn't just stumble onto places like this. I slowly reached for my knife, my hand trembling as I unzipped the sleeping bag as quietly as I could. The sound came again, circling the tent now like whoever it was trying to get a good look at it. My heart was pounding so loud I was sure they could hear it. I debated my options. Should I call out, announce myself, or would that just give away my position? Before I could decide, the sound stopped. The sudden silence was almost worse than the noise itself. I stayed frozen for what felt like hours, listening, waiting for something, anything, but there was nothing. Eventually, exhaustion won out, and I drifted into a restless sleep, knife still in my hand. The next morning, I stepped out of the tent to check my surroundings. At first glance, everything seemed normal. The fire pit, the trees, the stream, all untouched. But then I noticed the footprints. They were faint but unmistakable. Boot prints, not animal tracks, circling my tent. My stomach dropped. Whoever it was had been there, close enough to touch the fabric of the tent if they'd wanted to. I debated packing up and heading back, but pride and stubbornness got the better of me. I told myself it was probably nothing. Maybe a hunter or a lost hiker had wandered through. No harm done. Still, I couldn't shake the unease that had settled over me. I decided to move campsites just in case. By midday, I'd found another spot, deeper in the woods, near a small, stagnant pond. It wasn't as picturesque as the first sight, but it felt more secure, tucked away in a natural hollow surrounded by thick underbrush. I spent the afternoon fishing in the stream, trying to convince myself that everything was fine. I even caught a trout, which I cooked over the fire that evening. It should have been a good day. It wasn't. That night, the sounds came back. This time, they were louder, bolder. Footsteps, snapping branches, and what sounded like someone's breath, heavy and labored. It was unmistakable now. Someone was out there, watching me. I lay in my tent, gripping the knife so hard my hand ached. I didn't sleep at all. When dawn finally broke, I decided I'd had enough. I packed up my gear in record time and started back toward the trailhead. But the unease followed me. Every so often, I'd hear a sound, a crack, a rustle, and whip around, only to see nothing. The sense of being watched was constant, oppressive. Halfway back to the car, I found something that stopped me cold. A tree freshly carved. The bark had been stripped away in jagged lines, and in the exposed wood, there was a single word scratched deep: leave. My blood turned to ice. I didn't stick around to analyze it. I practically ran the rest of the way, my pack bouncing painfully against my back, my lungs burning. When I finally reached the car, I threw my gear in the back, jumped in, and locked the doors. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the key into the ignition. The drive back to civilization was a blur. I didn't relax until I was miles away, the trees thinning and the comforting signs of human activity reappearing. Gas stations, billboards, other cars. Even now, back home, the experience haunts me. I've replayed it in my mind 1,000 times, trying to make sense of it. Who was out there? What did they want? And why did they let me go? I've told myself 100 stories to rationalize it. A prank, a paranoid local, a coincidence. But the truth is, I'll never know. And that's the part that scares me the most. I'm not the kind of person who scares easily. I've been hiking and camping alone for years, and I've always found peace in the solitude of nature. There's something about being out in the wilderness, away from the noise and distractions of everyday life, that clears my head. But what happened on my last solo trip changed the way I think about being alone in the woods. The trip started like any other. I had planned a 3-day hike through a remote section of the national forest, an area I hadn't explored before. The trail wasn't marked on most maps, but I'd read about it in an online forum for experienced hikers. Supposedly, it offered incredible views and a level of isolation you couldn't find in more popular spots. That was exactly what I was looking for. I packed light but thorough. My tent, sleeping bag, water filter, stove, and enough food for 3 days fit neatly into my pack. I brought a paper map of the area and a GPS device, even though I knew I'd rarely get a signal. My knife and first aid kit were tucked into side pockets, just in case. I've always been cautious. It's one of the reasons I've never run into trouble before. The first day was uneventful. The trailhead was deserted when I arrived, which didn't surprise me given the time of year. It was early autumn, and while the days were still warm, the nights were getting colder. Most casual campers had packed it in for the season. I hiked for about 6 hours, stopping occasionally to admire the changing leaves or refill my water bottle from a stream. The trail was challenging but manageable, winding through dense forest and up steep ridges. By late afternoon, I'd reached a small clearing where I decided to set up camp for the night. The clearing was perfect. It was flat and surrounded by trees, with a small fire ring left by previous hikers. I pitched my tent, gathered some wood, and got a fire going just as the sun dipped below the horizon. Dinner was a simple affair: instant noodles and a granola bar. I sat by the fire, watching the flames dance and listening to the sounds of the forest. The rustling leaves, the distant hoot of an owl, It was the kind of white noise that lulls you into a sense of safety. By the time I crawled into my sleeping bag, I felt completely at ease. The second day was when things started to feel off. I woke up early, eager to cover as much ground as possible. The trail grew narrower and less defined as I went deeper into the forest. At times, I had to stop and double-check my map to make sure I was still on course. Around midday, I noticed something strange. The forest was unusually quiet. The birdsong that had been a constant backdrop to my hike was gone, and even the sound of the wind in the trees seemed muted. It wasn't until I stumbled across the first sign that I began to feel uneasy. It was a footprint, not mine, and not the kind you'd expect to see this far off the beaten path. It was fresh, pressed into the soft dirt of the trail, and larger than any boot I'd ever seen. My first thought was that it belonged to a hunter or another hiker, but something about it didn't sit right with me. The stride was long, almost unnaturally so, and there was no sign of any other prints nearby. I told myself it was nothing, maybe just an odd trick of the soil, and kept moving. By late afternoon, I'd reached a ridge with a breathtaking view of the valley below. I stopped to rest, sitting on a rock and pulling out a snack. That's when I noticed it again, the quiet. It wasn't just the absence of birds or insects this time. It felt like the entire forest was holding its breath. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I scanned the treeline but saw nothing. Still, the sense of unease stayed with me as I continued down the trail. I made camp earlier than usual that evening, choosing a spot close to a stream where I could refill my water supply. The fire seemed smaller than the night before, its light barely reaching the edges of the clearing. I ate quickly and climbed into my tent, zipping it up tight. Sleep didn't come easily. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up to a sound. It was faint, but distinct. The crunch of leaves underfoot. My heart started racing as I lay there, straining to hear more. The sound came again, closer this time. It wasn't the random rustle of an animal moving through the underbrush. It was deliberate, measured, like footsteps. I reached for my knife, gripping it tightly as I listened. The footsteps stopped just outside my tent. For what felt like an eternity, there was nothing but silence. Then, a low, guttural sound broke the stillness. It wasn't quite a growl, but it sent a chill down my spine. I didn't dare move. Eventually, the sound faded, and the footsteps retreated. I stayed awake for the rest of the night, knife in hand, jumping at every snap of a twig. When dawn finally broke, I stepped out of my tent to find the ground around my campsite undisturbed. No footprints, no signs of anything unusual. I started to wonder if I'd imagined it all, the product of an overactive mind and too much time alone. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I decided to cut my trip short and head back to the trailhead. The hike back was grueling. I kept looking over my shoulder, convinced that I was being followed. Every rustle of leaves, every shadow among the trees, set my nerves on edge. The forest, so familiar and comforting just days ago, now felt alien and menacing. It wasn't until I reached the trailhead that I allowed myself to breathe. My car was right where I'd left it, a reassuring sight in the otherwise desolate parking lot. As I loaded my pack into the trunk, I noticed something on the ground nearby. A single footprint, larger than my own, pressed into the dirt. My stomach dropped. I didn't stick around to investigate. The drive home was a blur, my mind racing with questions I couldn't answer. What had I heard that night? Who or what had left those footprints? And why did I feel like I'd only narrowly escaped something I couldn't begin to understand? It's been weeks since that trip, and I still can't shake the memory. I've replayed it over and over in my head, trying to make sense of it. Maybe there's a rational explanation, some mundane detail I'm overlooking. Or maybe the wilderness isn't as empty as we like to think it is. I haven't been camping since. It started as a weekend trip to escape the grind of the city. My plan was simple: head out to a remote campsite I'd researched online, spend a couple of nights under the stars, and reset. The photos had shown a tranquil lake surrounded by thick forests, with hiking trails weaving through untouched wilderness. It seemed perfect for some solitude and reflection. The drive out took longer than expected. A stretch of dirt road leading to the campsite was riddled with potholes and sharp turns that my car's GPS didn't account for. By the time I arrived, the sun was already dipping below the treetops, casting long shadows that made the forest look even denser than it had during the drive. There were no other cars in the parking area, which was a relief. I wanted to be alone, and it seemed like I had the place all to myself. I grabbed my gear, a tent, sleeping bag, food supplies, and a small first aid kit, and set off down the trail toward the lake. The path was narrow but well-worn, winding through trees so thick they blocked out most of the remaining light. The air was cool and carried the earthy scent of moss and pine. Birds chirped somewhere high in the branches, their calls fading as I got deeper into the forest. By the time I reached the lake, dusk had settled in. The water was a sheet of glass, reflecting the fiery oranges and purples of the sky. I found a flat spot near the shore to set up my tent. After staking it down and rolling out my sleeping bag, I started a small fire using the wood I'd gathered along the trail. The crackle of the flames was comforting, breaking the silence that had grown heavier with the night. Dinner was simple: a can of beans heated over the fire and a granola bar for dessert. I leaned back against a log and let the day's tension melt away. Above me, the sky was a canvas of stars, brighter and clearer than I'd ever seen them in the city. The lake mirrored the starlight, creating an almost surreal sense of calm. As the fire burned low, I doused it with water from the lake and crawled into my tent. The silence was profound, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant call of an owl. I fell asleep easily, lulled by the rhythmic sound of my own breathing. The first night passed uneventfully. I woke early to the golden light of dawn filtering through the tent. The lake was shrouded in mist, and the air was crisp and cold. After a quick breakfast of instant oatmeal, I packed a day pack with water, snacks, and a map of the area. My plan was to hike one of the longer trails that looped around the lake and into the hills beyond. The trail was more challenging than I'd expected, with steep inclines and rocky terrain. Still, it was exhilarating. The forest was alive with sound, the crunch of my boots on the path, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush, the distant murmur of a stream. I stopped occasionally to catch my breath and take in the view. The higher I climbed, the more of the lake I could see, its surface now glittering in the mid-morning sun. Around midday, I found a clearing with a fallen log and decided to take a break. I ate an apple and some trail mix, washing it down with water from my bottle. The forest was quieter here, the sounds of wildlife more subdued. I checked my map and realized I was about halfway through the loop. Feeling refreshed, I started back down the trail. It was on the return leg that I first felt it, a subtle shift in the atmosphere. The forest, so vibrant and full of life earlier, seemed to grow darker, even though the sun was still high. The usual sounds of birds and insects were absent, replaced by an unsettling stillness. I tried to brush it off as my imagination, but a prickling sensation on the back of my neck made me quicken my pace. About a mile from the campsite, I noticed something strange. A small stack of stones stood beside the trail, balanced precariously one on top of the other. It hadn't been there on my way out. I paused, my heart beating a little faster. Could have been nothing. Maybe another hiker had passed through and left it as a marker. But I hadn't seen or heard anyone all day. Pushing the thought aside, I continued on, determined not to let a pile of rocks spook me. When I reached the campsite, the sun was beginning to set again, casting the lake in shades of amber and gold. I started another fire, this time keeping it larger and closer to the tent. Something about the stillness of the forest made me uneasy. I told myself it was just the isolation playing tricks on me. That night, I had trouble sleeping. Every sound outside the tent seemed amplified. The snap of a twig, the rustle of leaves, the distant howl of the wind. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps crunching on the gravel near the shore. I sat up, heart pounding, and strained to listen. The sound didn't come again, but I stayed awake for what felt like hours, staring at the tent's ceiling and clutching my flashlight. Morning couldn't come fast enough. When the first light of dawn crept into the tent, I threw off the sleeping bag and stepped outside. The air was heavy with fog, and the lake was eerily still. I decided to cut my trip short. Whatever peace I'd come here to find was overshadowed by an unshakable sense of unease. As I packed up my gear, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Near the fire pit where I'd been sitting the night before was another stack of stones, identical to the one I'd seen on the trail. I hadn't made it. My hands shook as I hurried to dismantle the tent and stuff everything into my backpack. The hike back to the parking area was a blur. I moved as quickly as I could without running, constantly glancing over my shoulder. The forest felt oppressive, the trees towering over me like silent witnesses. Every now and then, I thought I heard faint noises, a branch snapping, leaves rustling. But when I turned, there was nothing there. When I finally reached the parking lot, my car was the only one there, just as I'd left it. Relief flooded over me as I threw my gear into the trunk and climbed into the driver's seat. The engine roared to life, and I sped down the dirt road, not caring about the potholes or sharp turns. It wasn't until I was miles away, back on the main highway, that I began to relax. The tension in my shoulders eased, and my breathing slowed. I told myself it had been nothing, just my imagination fueled by isolation and the eerie stillness of the forest. But as I reached for the water bottle in the cup holder, I noticed something that made my heart stop. Sitting on the dashboard, balanced perfectly despite the car's vibrations, was a small stack of stones. I still don't know why I decided to go on that solo camping trip. Maybe it was a need to escape the monotony of life, or maybe I just wanted to prove to myself that I could do it. Whatever the reason, I found myself deep in the woods on a cold October afternoon, setting up my tent in the fading light of the day. The forest was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that settles deep into your bones. The only sounds were the crunch of fallen leaves under my boots and the occasional rustle of wind through the trees. I had chosen a spot near a small clearing, not too far from a narrow creek. It seemed perfect at the time, the kind of place you'd see in a hiking magazine, promising serenity and a connection to nature. After setting up my tent and organizing my gear, I built a small fire. The warmth and light were comforting, and I cooked a simple dinner of canned beans and some bread. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the forest transformed. Shadows grew long, and the trees seemed to shift and sway in the dim light. I tried not to let it get to me. I reminded myself that I was alone out here, far from any roads or people. It was just me and the wilderness. By the time I crawled into my sleeping bag, the fire had burned down to embers. The night air was crisp and biting, and the faint sound of the creek nearby was oddly soothing. I had my knife close by, a small flashlight, and a whistle just in case. I wasn't afraid of animals. I had read enough to know that most wildlife wanted nothing to do with humans. Still, there was a nagging sense of vulnerability that came with being out there alone. I don't know what woke me up the first time. It might have been a dream, or maybe the subtle shift in the wind. My eyes snapped open, and for a moment, I was disoriented. The inside of the tent was pitch black, save for the faint glow of moonlight filtering through the nylon fabric. I stayed still, listening. The forest was no longer silent. There was a faint crunching sound, like something moving through the leaves. It wasn't constant, just an intermittent rustling that seemed to come from different directions. I told myself it was nothing, maybe a raccoon or a deer wandering through. I'd heard stories of how sounds could play tricks on you in the woods, but the noise didn't stop. It grew louder, closer, and then silence. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I strained to hear anything else. The quiet was almost worse than the sound. I lay there for what felt like hours, clutching my knife and flashlight, too scared to move. Eventually, exhaustion won out, and I drifted off to an uneasy sleep. The next morning, the forest seemed normal again. The sunlight filtered through the trees, and the sounds of birds chirping replaced the eerie silence of the night. I tried to shake off the unease. It was probably just an animal. I told myself that over and over as I ate breakfast and planned out a short hike for the day. The trail I followed was faint, more of a game trail than a proper path. I didn't mind. It felt more adventurous that way. The woods were dense, the kind of place where you could get lost if you weren't careful. I had a map and a compass, but I still marked trees with small ribbons of cloth as I walked, just to be safe. About an hour into the hike, I stumbled across something odd. It was a tree, stripped of its bark in long, jagged strips. Deep claw marks gouged into the wood. It didn't look fresh, but it was unsettling nonetheless. I'd read about bears marking trees, but this seemed different. The marks were too high, the spacing too wide. I took a picture with my phone and kept walking, trying to push the image from my mind. The further I went, the more uneasy I felt. The forest seemed darker here, the trees closer together. I noticed little things that felt off. A patch of moss growing on the wrong side of a tree, a pile of rocks that seemed deliberately stacked. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. By the time I decided to turn back, the sky was starting to gray with the approach of evening. I quickened my pace, following the markers I had left. But something was wrong. I came across a tree I didn't recognize, one that I hadn't marked. I tried to stay calm, telling myself I must have made a mistake, but the truth was sinking in. I was lost. Panic started to set in, but I forced myself to breathe. I pulled out my compass and map, trying to orient myself. It didn't help much. The dense forest all looked the same, and the fading light wasn't helping. I picked a direction that I thought would lead me back to the creek and started walking. That's when I saw it. A structure barely visible through the trees. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, but as I got closer, I realized it was real. It looked like an old hunting blind or shack, weathered and overgrown with moss and vines. It didn't make sense. I hadn't seen it on the way out, and it wasn't marked on the map. Curiosity got the better of me, and I approached cautiously. The door was hanging open, creaking slightly in the wind. Inside, it was dark and musty, the floor littered with debris and animal droppings. There was an old chair in one corner, a rusted lantern on a shelf, and something else, pile of bones. Small ones, maybe from a rabbit or squirrel, but they were arranged in a strange pattern, almost like a symbol. A chill ran down my spine, and I backed out of the shack quickly. The forest felt alive now, the trees pressing in on me. I turned and started walking, almost running, in what I hoped was the right direction. My breathing was ragged, my heart pounding. I don't know how long I walked before I found the creek. Relief washed over me, and I followed it downstream, recognizing landmarks until I finally stumbled back into my campsite. It was almost dark, and I wasted no time building up the fire. The flames felt like a shield against the encroaching darkness. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat by the fire, clutching my knife, jumping at every sound. The forest was alive with noises. Cracks, snaps, rustling, but nothing ever came close. When dawn finally broke, I packed up as quickly as I could. The hike back to my car was grueling, every shadow a potential threat. When I finally saw the parking lot, I almost cried with relief. I threw my gear in the car and didn't look back. I still don't know what I encountered out there. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me, amplified by the isolation and fear. Or maybe there was someone out there watching. I've thought about going back, trying to find that shack again. But every time I think about it, I remember the silence of the woods, the feeling of being watched, and I decide to stay home. It was supposed to be a simple weekend camping trip. Nothing too adventurous, just a chance to get away from the city's noise and breathe some fresh air. I packed light, a tent, sleeping bag, some food, water, and a basic first aid kit. I didn't need much. The forest I'd chosen wasn't far from the main road, a place popular with weekend hikers. But I made one mistake. I decided to camp in a spot further out, away from the usual trail. I arrived in the late afternoon, the sun still high but lazily dipping toward the horizon. The forest was peaceful. Birds chirped in the canopy above, and the occasional rustle of leaves hinted at a deer or squirrel darting through the underbrush. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, a mix that immediately relaxed me. The spot I found was perfect. A small clearing, ringed by trees, with a soft patch of grass where I could pitch my tent. I set up quickly, hammering the stakes into the ground and rolling out my sleeping bag. By the time I finished, the sun had begun to set, casting long shadows across the forest floor. I started a small fire, careful to keep it contained with a ring of stones. Dinner was simple, just some canned beans and bread, but it tasted amazing out there under the open sky. As the evening deepened, the sounds of the forest changed. The birds quieted, replaced by the occasional hoot of an owl or the chirping of crickets. The air grew cooler, and I pulled my jacket tight around me. I stared into the flames of my fire, letting my mind wander. It was one of those moments where everything felt right, peaceful, safe. That feeling didn't last. It started with a faint sound, a crack, like a twig snapping underfoot. First, I ignored it. Forests are full of sounds, I reminded myself. Animals move through the brush, branches fall. But then it came again, closer this time, sharp and deliberate. I turned, scanning the dark edges of the clearing. The fire's light didn't reach far, leaving most of the forest shrouded in black. I squinted, trying to make out shapes among the trees, but saw nothing. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, watching. I told myself it was just my imagination. Being alone in the woods can mess with your head, amplify every sound and shadow. But then I heard it again, this time to my left. Another snap, followed by a faint rustling. My stomach tightened. It wasn't just an animal passing through. The sounds were too steady, too deliberate. I stood up, my heart pounding, and grabbed the small flashlight from my pack. I shone it toward the trees, sweeping the beam back and forth. "Hello," I called out, my voice cracking slightly. I felt foolish as soon as the word left my mouth. Who was I expecting to answer? Silence. The forest seemed to hold its breath, the usual nighttime sounds momentarily absent. I stood there for a long minute, straining my ears, but nothing happened. Finally, I convinced myself it was a raccoon or some other harmless creature. I sat back down by the fire, though I couldn't fully relax. The fire burned low as the night deepened, and I decided it was time to turn in. I doused the flames with water, making sure every ember was out, and crawled into my tent. The fabric walls felt flimsy, offering little protection from whatever might be outside, but I tried to push the thought away. I zipped up the tent, slid into my sleeping bag, and closed my eyes. Sleep didn't come easily. Every little sound, the wind in the trees, the rustle of leaves, seemed amplified. I kept telling myself it was nothing, but the unease lingered. Then, just as I started to drift off, I heard it again. That same snapping sound, closer now. My eyes flew open, and I lay there, frozen, barely breathing. The sound came again, followed by another. Footsteps, slow, measured, and unmistakable. They circled the tent, crunching softly on the forest floor. I'd brought a knife with me, just a small one, meant more for cutting rope than anything else. I reached for it now, gripping it tightly in my hand. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment, there was nothing but the sound of my own ragged breathing. Then came a new sound, a soft scrape, like something brushing against the tent fabric. My mind raced. An animal? But what kind? And why was it lingering? I wanted to unzip the tent, to look outside and see what it was, but fear held me back. If it was dangerous, unzipping the tent would leave me exposed. So I stayed still, gripping the knife, and waited. The scraping stopped, and the footsteps resumed, moving away this time. I listened as they grew fainter and fainter, until they disappeared entirely. I stayed awake for hours after that, every muscle in my body tense, straining to hear any hint of movement. But the forest remained quiet. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I fell into a restless sleep. When I woke, the sun was up, its light filtering through the thin walls of the tent. I crawled out, blinking in the bright morning. The clearing looked the same as it had the day before, peaceful and undisturbed. But then I saw the footprints. They were faint but unmistakable, pressed into the soft earth around my tent. They weren't animal tracks. They were human, barefoot by the looks of it and larger than my own. My stomach dropped as I counted them. Whoever it was had circled my tent multiple times. I packed up quickly, my hands shaking. The peaceful feeling I'd had when I arrived was long gone, replaced by a gnawing fear. I planned to stay another night, but I couldn't. Not after this. I needed to get out of there. The hike back to the car felt longer than it had on the way in. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves set my nerves on edge. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone following me, but the trail remained empty. When I finally reached my car, I threw my gear into the trunk and locked the doors as soon as I got inside. My hands were still shaking as I started the engine and pulled onto the road. I didn't stop until I was miles away. Even now, I can't fully explain what happened. Maybe it was just some weirdo passing through the woods. Maybe they meant no harm. But the way they moved, the way they lingered, it didn't feel harmless. It felt deliberate, intentional. I haven't been camping since. The air smelled like damp earth and pine as I zipped up my jacket. I had always loved the wilderness. It was my escape, my place to breathe when life felt too loud. This weekend was supposed to be simple, just me, my gear, and the woods. I found a secluded spot near a creek, about 6 miles from the trailhead. It was perfect. No other campers in sight, just the hum of the forest and the occasional rustle of leaves. By late afternoon, I had my tent pitched and a fire crackling. The light was soft, filtering through the canopy above, and the only sounds were the steady flow of water and the distant chirp of birds. It was peaceful, almost hypnotic. I spent the evening cooking a simple meal over the fire, watching the sun dip below the horizon. When night came, the darkness wrapped around me like a blanket. I crawled into my sleeping bag and let the rhythmic sounds of the creek lull me to sleep. I woke up sometime in the middle of the night. My body felt stiff, and for a moment, I wasn't sure what had woken me. The fire outside had died to glowing embers, but the moon cast enough light for me to see shadows shifting in the trees. I thought I heard something, a faint crunch, like someone stepping on dry leaves. My heart quickened, but I told myself it was probably just a deer or some other nocturnal animal. Still, I reached for the small knife I always kept near my sleeping bag, just in case. The sound came again, closer this time. It wasn't steady, like footsteps, but sporadic. I strained my ears, trying to separate the noises of the forest from whatever else might be out there. Then silence. No wind, no rustling, no chirping. Just silence. I don't know how long I lay there, gripping the handle of my knife and listening, but eventually, exhaustion won out and I drifted back to sleep. The next morning, I stepped out of my tent and surveyed the area. Nothing looked out of place, but the ground near my campfire had faint impressions, almost like footprints. They weren't clear enough to make out, and I convinced myself they were from some animal. I shook off the unease and went about my day. I spent hours hiking, following the creek upstream, and admiring the untouched beauty of the forest. By the time I returned to camp, the sun was low in the sky, and my legs ached from the miles I had covered. That evening, I built the fire higher and kept it going longer. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone out there. I've camped solo dozens of times, but this felt different. The forest, usually so alive, seemed muted. The usual sounds were there, but they felt distant, as if the woods were holding their breath. I ate quickly and stayed close to the fire until I couldn't keep my eyes open any longer. I woke again in the middle of the night. This time, the sound was unmistakable. Footsteps, not an animal's shuffle, but deliberate human footsteps. My heart pounded in my chest as I lay perfectly still, listening. They circled the perimeter of my campsite, slow and measured. Whoever it was, they were trying to stay quiet. My mind raced. Should I call out? Stay silent? Grab my knife and confront them? The footsteps stopped. I held my breath, every muscle in my body tense. Minutes passed, and then, just as I thought they might have gone, I heard a faint rustling near my tent. My knife was in my hand before I realized I had reached for it. I sat up slowly, trying to make as little noise as possible. The rustling continued, just outside. I swallowed hard, gripping the knife so tightly my knuckles ached. Then, just like that, it stopped. I waited, straining to hear anything over the sound of my own heartbeat. The silence stretched on until the first light of dawn began to seep through the fabric of my tent. When I finally unzipped it and stepped outside, the campsite was eerily still. My fire pit had been disturbed. The stones were scattered, and the ashes looked as though someone had sifted through them. But the thing that chilled me to my core was the rope. A length of paracord from my gear had been tied between two trees, forming a crude tripwire just outside my tent. I hadn't set it. Someone had been there, close enough to go through my belongings while I slept. I packed up in record time, every sound making my head snap around. The hike back to the trailhead was the longest 6 miles of my life. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone following me. The forest, so beautiful just a day ago, now felt oppressive. Every shadow seemed to hide a figure, every rustle a threat. When I finally reached my car, I threw my gear into the trunk and locked the doors, as if that could somehow erase the fear that had gripped me. I sat there for a long time, staring at the trees, before finally turning the key in the ignition. As I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was still out there, watching. I never found out who it was or what they wanted. Maybe it was just someone messing around, trying to scare me. Maybe it was something darker. I don't know. What I do know is that I'll never camp alone again. The wilderness doesn't feel like an escape anymore. It feels like a place where, if you're not careful, you might just disappear. I've always been a big fan of camping. Being out in the wilderness, away from the noise of the city, feels like a reset button for my mind. It's like stepping back in time, away from screens and obligations. So, when I had a rare weekend free, I decided to pack up my gear and head out alone. I'd done plenty of solo trips before, and I'd grown comfortable navigating the woods by myself. Maybe a little too comfortable. The place I picked was about 2 hours' drive from my house, tucked deep in a national forest. It wasn't a marked campsite, just a spot I'd heard about from a coworker who said it was quiet and rarely visited. Exactly what I was looking for. The weather was forecasted to be perfect. Clear skies, mild temperatures, and just enough of a breeze to keep the bugs at bay. I arrived around noon, parked my car at the edge of a dirt road, and loaded up my pack. It was a bit of a hike to the spot, but nothing too strenuous. The trail wound through dense trees, their leaves forming a canopy that filtered the sunlight into golden patches on the forest floor. The air smelled earthy, mixed with the faint sweetness of wildflowers and the tang of pine. After about an hour, I reached a small clearing by a creek. The water trickled over smooth stones, creating a soothing background noise. The area looked untouched, just as I'd hoped. No footprints, no trash, no signs of other campers. It was perfect. I set up my tent a little way from the creek, on a patch of flat ground surrounded by tall trees. Once the tent was up, I gathered some wood for a fire later. The forest was alive with the sounds of birds and rustling leaves, but it felt peaceful rather than intimidating. I made a mental note of a few landmarks to make sure I'd be able to find my way back if I wandered too far. A fallen tree with moss-covered roots, a cluster of white birch trees, and a boulder shaped like a chair. The afternoon passed quietly. I read a book, fished a little in the creek, and even managed to catch a small trout. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, the air cooled, and the forest began to change. The chirping of birds gave way to the chirr of crickets, and the shadows stretched long and dark. I built a small fire and cooked the trout with some foil and seasoning I'd brought. It wasn't much, but it felt like a feast. Afterward, I sat by the fire, watching the flames dance and listening to the crackle of burning wood. The stars began to emerge, and I leaned back, staring up at the vastness of the sky. There was no moon, just the endless expanse of stars. The night was colder than I'd expected. Even with my sleeping bag, I felt the chill seeping in. I woke up once or twice, shifting around to find a warmer position. At some point, I thought I heard something outside the tent, a faint rustling, like footsteps. But it was brief, and I chalked it up to an animal passing by. Deer were common in these woods, and they could be surprisingly loud. The next morning, I stepped out of the tent and stretched, breathing in the crisp air. The ground was damp with dew, and a light mist hung over the creek. I boiled some water for coffee and ate a granola bar while planning my day. I'd brought a small map of the area, and there was a nearby ridge I wanted to hike to. The view from the top was supposed to be incredible. I packed a small day bag with water, snacks, and a first aid kit, then set off. The trail wasn't well defined, but I had my compass and landmarks to guide me. The forest felt alive with energy. Squirrels chittering, birds flitting between branches, the occasional rustle of undergrowth as some unseen creature darted away. As I climbed higher, the trees thinned out and the ground grew rockier. The trail became steeper, and I had to use my hands to steady myself on a few sections. But when I reached the top, the effort was worth it. The view was breathtaking. I could see for miles, rolling hills covered in trees, the glint of the creek far below, and the endless blue sky above. I sat there for a while, eating an apple and just taking it all in. The hike back down was uneventful, but by the time I returned to camp, I was tired. My legs ached, and I was looking forward to sitting by the fire again. But as I stepped into the clearing, something felt off. It took me a moment to realize what it was. My tent had been unzipped. Not fully, just enough to notice. I distinctly remembered zipping it up before I left. My pack, which I'd left inside, was now sitting outside the tent, its contents spilled onto the ground. My first thought was a bear, but there were no claw marks, no signs of rummaging. It looked deliberate, almost careful. I scanned the area, my heart pounding. The forest was quiet, too quiet. The usual background noise of birds and insects seemed muted. I called out, my voice shaky, but there was no response. I quickly gathered my scattered belongings and checked to see if anything was missing. My wallet, keys, and phone were all there, untouched. It didn't make sense. If it wasn't an animal and it wasn't theft, then what was it? I tried to shake off the unease and told myself it must have been a raccoon or some other curious animal. Still, I couldn't help but feel exposed, vulnerable. I spent the rest of the afternoon close to camp, keeping the fire going and glancing over my shoulder more often than I cared to admit. That night, I lay in my sleeping bag, listening intently. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves set my nerves on edge. At one point, I thought I heard faint breathing outside the tent. I froze, holding my breath, straining to hear. But the sound didn't come again, and eventually, I drifted into an uneasy sleep. The next morning, I decided to cut my trip short. The thought of spending another night alone out here didn't sit well with me. I packed up quickly, eager to be back on the trail and heading home. The hike back to the car was uneventful, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The forest seemed different now, less inviting, more oppressive. When I finally reached my car, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. As I loaded my gear into the trunk, I noticed something odd. Stuck under one of my windshield wipers was a piece of paper. I unfolded it, my hands trembling. It was blank except for a single sentence scrawled in messy handwriting. "You're lucky I let you leave." I didn't wait to find out who'd left it or what they meant. I got in the car, locked the doors, and drove away as fast as I could. To this day, I don't know what happened in those woods, but I haven't gone camping alone since. It was the kind of weekend trip I needed, the chance to escape the city and immerse myself in nature. No emails, no phone calls, no constant buzz of notifications. Just me, the woods, and the peaceful solitude of the mountains. I packed my gear the night before. Tent, sleeping bag, food, and a good flashlight. It wasn't my first time camping alone, but this time felt different. I was going deeper into the forest than I had before, far from any established trails or campsites. The drive out was peaceful. Rolling hills, the occasional glimpse of wildlife, deer grazing by the roadside, birds soaring overhead. The forest welcomed me with its dense greenery and the earthy scent of pine. I parked at a small clearing and started hiking in. The trail wasn't clear at all. I had to rely on landmarks and my compass to stay on track. Every step was a challenge, navigating through overgrown bushes and dodging fallen branches. The quiet of the wilderness was soothing, but after a while, it began to feel oppressive, too empty. By mid-afternoon, I found a spot that seemed perfect. A flat area near a small, babbling brook. Surrounded by tall trees that blocked most of the sun's rays, it was ideal. I set up my tent, positioned it so I could see the brook from the entrance. The sound of the water was calming. I laid down a few sticks to mark the spot, in case I needed to find my way back the next day. The first night was peaceful. I cooked some dehydrated food and listened to the sounds of the forest. Leaves rustling, distant bird calls. The occasional snap of a branch under an unseen animal's weight. It felt remote, almost untouched by civilization. I slept soundly, the only light coming from my small headlamp tucked away in my bag. The second day was when things started to feel different. The weather took a turn. Clouds rolled in, casting everything in a dull gray. I continued hiking, deeper into the forest. The path was more rugged now, the terrain harder to navigate. The silence was heavier, almost suffocating. No birdsong, no breeze rustling through the leaves, just the rhythmic crunch of twigs underfoot. I told myself it was nothing, just the weather. By evening, I found another spot near a small clearing. There was no one else around as far as I could tell. I set up camp again, but this time something felt off. The air was colder, heavier. The sounds of the forest felt muted, almost unnatural. I tried to shake off the unease. Maybe it was just my imagination running wild. I didn't think much of it and settled in for the night. It was in the middle of the night that I woke up. The tent was cold. The fire I had built long since burnt out. I checked my watch, 3:24 a.m. The silence was worse now. Even the smallest sounds, like the rustle of leaves, made my skin crawl. I lay there for a while, trying to convince myself it was just the wind playing tricks on me. But the sound I heard next made my heart stop. A voice, faint whisper, barely audible, but it was there. "Help me." My breath caught in my throat. I sat up slowly, straining to hear more, but there was nothing else, just silence again. My flashlight was still by the entrance of the tent. I grabbed it, switched it on, and shone it outside. The beam danced across the forest, revealing nothing but trees, shadows, and the faint glow of the brook. I stayed awake for the rest of the night, my senses heightened. The whisper haunted me, even in the daylight. I packed up camp early, wanting nothing more than to get out of there. As I made my way back along the trail, every snap of a twig behind me had my heart racing. But there was never anything there. Hours passed, and I was beginning to think I was just overreacting, until I reached the spot where I had laid down those sticks to mark my trail. They were gone. In their place, fresh footprints led deeper into the forest, smaller, uneven steps that didn't match mine. I followed them for a short while before stopping. The unease returned tenfold. What was out there? Was it another hiker who had wandered off the trail? Or something worse? I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that something or someone was following me. As the sun set, I quickened my pace. I wanted to be back in the open, where I could see the sky, where civilization wasn't so far away. The forest grew darker with each step, the trees pressing in tighter around me. I couldn't hear anything but my own footsteps and the occasional rustle of leaves. Then I heard it again, a faint whisper. Only this time it was right behind me. "Help me." The voice was clearer, more insistent. I swung around, flashlight ready, but the beam revealed nothing but the empty path. Panic set in. I didn't stop again. Couldn't. Every noise seemed amplified. Branches cracking under unseen weight. The swish of something moving in the bushes. My breath came in short bursts, and every ounce of rational thought fled. Finally, I broke through the forest's edge and stumbled into the open. The moon was high in the sky, casting pale light over the surrounding landscape. I fell to my knees, gasping for air. My eyes darted around, scanning the emptiness. The forest seemed to stretch infinitely behind me, but there was no voice, no footprints, no presence. I never returned to that place. Not in the daylight, not at all. Whatever it was, whatever followed me, stayed in the woods. And every time I camp since, I make sure I never venture too far into the wilderness. Some things are better left untouched. I didn't expect the trip to turn out the way it did. I had planned everything meticulously, right down to the snacks, the map, and the backup battery packs. The idea was to escape for a weekend, away from the noise of the city, the endless emails, and the pressure of work. I thought I could find some peace in the quiet woods. Instead, I found something I wasn't prepared for. It started like any other camping trip. I drove out early Friday morning to beat the weekend rush. The trailhead was about 2 hours away, tucked deep into a state forest that wasn't as popular as some of the larger parks nearby. That's why I picked it. I didn't want crowds or even a chance of running into other hikers. I needed solitude. The first few hours on the trail were uneventful. The late autumn air was crisp but not freezing, and the trail was well marked, winding through dense pines and patches of leafless oaks. The only sounds were the crunch of my boots on the path and the occasional rustling of animals in the underbrush. It felt good to disconnect, to breathe air that wasn't tinged with exhaust fumes or the stale stench of office coffee. I reached my planned campsite by mid-afternoon. It was a clearing beside a small creek, with just enough flat ground for my tent. The creek bubbled softly, and the late afternoon sun filtered through the trees, casting long shadows over the ground. It was exactly what I'd hoped for. I set up my tent quickly and gathered some wood for a small fire later. By the time the sun began to dip below the horizon, I had everything ready. A small pile of firewood, my sleeping bag unrolled inside the tent, and my food stored safely away in a bare canister. Dinner was simple, dehydrated soup and a handful of trail mix, but it tasted better out here. Everything always does. The first night was uneventful, though I didn't sleep as well as I hoped. The forest was alive with noises, branches creaking in the wind, leaves rustling, and the occasional snap of a twig that made me sit up in my sleeping bag, heart pounding. But nothing ever came close to my tent, and by the time dawn broke, I felt more foolish than scared. The second day, I decided to explore the area around my campsite. The map showed a small lake about 2 miles further down the trail, and I figured it would make for a good destination. I packed a small day bag with water, snacks, and my map, then set off. The hike was harder than I expected. The trail was less maintained the further I went, and in some places it disappeared altogether. I had to rely on the map and my compass to keep my bearings, but eventually I found the lake. It wasn't much, just a small stagnant pond, really, but it was quiet, and I spent an hour sitting on a rock by the edge enjoying the stillness. On my way back to camp, I noticed something strange. A set of footprints crossed the trail, fresh ones. They weren't mine, and they weren't there on my way to the lake. The prints were deep, made by someone wearing heavy boots, and they headed off the trail into the woods. I stopped and listened, but the forest was silent. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe another hiker had passed by while I was at the lake, though I hadn't seen or heard anyone. Still, it unnerved me. I kept checking over my shoulder as I made my way back to camp, my pace quickening with every step. By the time I reached my campsite, the sun was already setting. I lit a fire and tried to shake off the unease, convincing myself I was overreacting. But that night, sleep didn't come easily. Every sound outside the tent felt amplified, every rustle of leaves or snap of a branch sending a jolt of adrenaline through me. Around midnight, I heard it, a low, deliberate crunch of footsteps on the dry leaves just beyond the clearing. I froze, straining to hear more. The steps were slow, measured, and they circled my campsite. I didn't move. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure whoever, or whatever, it was could hear it. The footsteps stopped for a moment, then started again, moving away from the tent and into the woods. I stayed awake the rest of the night, clutching the knife I always kept in my pack, listening for any sound of a return. When dawn broke, I stepped out of the tent cautiously. There were no signs of anyone or anything around the campsite, but the footprints were back, circling the tent and then heading off into the woods. I decided to cut the trip short. I packed up quickly, my movements hurried and clumsy. The trail back to the car felt longer than it should have, every sound in the forest putting me on edge. About halfway back to the trailhead, I found something that made my stomach drop, a makeshift camp hidden just off the trail. It wasn't much, just a tarp strung between 2 trees, with a few empty cans and a smoldering fire pit. But what caught my attention was what was hanging from the tarp. A series of Polaroid photos, pinned up with clothespins. They were pictures of me. One showed me sitting by the lake. Another captured me gathering firewood near my campsite. The last one was the worst. It was a close-up of my tent, taken at night, with the faint glow of my flashlight visible through the fabric. I didn't stay to look at anything else. I ran the rest of the way back to my car, not stopping until I was behind the wheel with the doors locked. To this day, I don't know who was out there or why they were watching me. I reported the incident to the local rangers, but they never found anything. I haven't been camping since. I was always drawn to the solitude of the wilderness. The way the world quieted down when you were deep in the woods was something I couldn't get enough of. No cars, no phones, no hum of modern life, just you and nature. That's why I planned a solo camping trip deep in the forested hills of Vermont, where I grew up. I had a week off work, and I couldn't think of a better way to use it. I chose a spot far from any marked trails. It wasn't my first solo trip, and I was confident in my navigation skills. I packed everything I thought I'd need. A sturdy tent, sleeping bag, enough food for several days, water purification tablets, a first aid kit, and a reliable map of the area. I even double-checked my gear before setting out, making sure my compass and headlamp had spare batteries. I felt ready for anything. The hike to my chosen spot was grueling but beautiful. The terrain was rugged, with steep inclines and rocky outcroppings, but the views made it worth every step. Tall pines and birches surrounded me, their trunks swaying gently in the breeze. The smell of damp earth and pine needles filled the air, and I could hear the distant sound of a stream trickling down the hillside. I found a flat, secluded area near the stream to set up camp. It was perfect, quiet, with plenty of shade and a reliable water source nearby. The first day went smoothly. I pitched my tent, gathered firewood, and cooked a simple meal over the campfire. As the sun set, the forest transformed. The temperature dropped quickly, and the shadows grew longer. The chirping of birds gave way to the sounds of crickets and the occasional rustle of leaves. I felt a calmness settle over me as I stared into the flames of my campfire. This was exactly what I needed, a break from the chaos of everyday life. The second day was just as peaceful. I spent the morning exploring the area, following the stream to see where it led. The water was crystal clear, and I spotted a few trout darting around. I didn't bring fishing gear, but it was nice to know I could catch something if I needed to. I found a few interesting rock formations and even a small cave, though I didn't venture too far inside. By the time I returned to camp, the sun was high overhead, and I was ready for a hearty lunch. That evening, I noticed something strange. While gathering more firewood, I found what looked like an old campsite a few hundred yards from my own. It wasn't recent. The fire pit was nothing but a ring of blackened stones, and the area was overgrown with weeds. But what struck me as odd was the way it seemed hastily abandoned. A few rusted cans were scattered around, and there was a tattered sleeping bag partially buried under fallen leaves. It made me uneasy, but I brushed it off. Maybe it had belonged to a hunter or a camper who left in a hurry for some reason. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something about it wasn't right. That night, I woke up to a sound outside my tent. It was faint at first, a soft crunching like footsteps on dry leaves. My heart raced as I lay perfectly still, straining to hear more. The sound came again, closer this time. I grabbed my flashlight and slowly unzipped the tent. Shining the beam into the darkness, I couldn't see anything unusual, just the trees swaying in the wind and the faint outline of my campfire's embers. I told myself it was probably a deer or some other animal and forced myself to go back to sleep. The next day, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I chalked it up to paranoia and tried to focus on enjoying the day. I went for another hike, this time venturing further from camp. As I climbed a steep hill, I noticed something odd. A tree with deep scratches running down its trunk. They were too high up to be from a bear, and the marks looked deliberate, like someone had used a knife or a sharp tool. It was unsettling, but I reminded myself that people did strange things in the woods sometimes. That evening, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone standing there. By the time I got back to camp, the sun was setting, and the shadows seemed darker than usual. I built the fire bigger than the previous nights, its light making me feel a bit safer. Still, I couldn't relax. I kept hearing faint noises in the distance, branches snapping, leaves rustling, and every time I turned my head, there was nothing there. When night fell, I decided to stay awake for a while and keep the fire going. I sat with my back to the tent, flashlight in hand, scanning the darkness beyond the circle of light. Hours passed, and the forest was eerily quiet. Then I heard it again, the sound of footsteps. This time, they were deliberate and steady, coming from the direction of the old campsite I had found. My pulse quickened as I pointed the flashlight toward the sound, but I still couldn't see anything. The footsteps stopped just beyond the firelight. I felt a wave of dread wash over me. Whoever or whatever it was, they were standing there watching me. I shouted into the darkness, hoping to scare them off, but there was no response. I threw a burning stick from the fire in their direction, and the footsteps retreated quickly, fading into the distance. I didn't sleep at all that night. By morning, I had made up my mind to leave. I packed my gear as quickly as I could, constantly looking over my shoulder. The feeling of being watched hadn't gone away, and I couldn't shake the sense that I wasn't alone. As I started the hike back, every sound in the forest set me on edge. A snapping twig, the rustle of leaves. It all made my heart race. The hike out was grueling. I was exhausted from lack of sleep and constantly looking over my shoulder. At one point, I thought I saw a figure in the distance, standing among the trees. I froze, staring at it, but when I blinked, it was gone. My pace quickened after that, and I didn't stop until I reached my car. When I finally made it back to civilization, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief. I don't know who or what was out there in the woods with me, but I'm certain of one thing: I wasn't alone. Whatever their intentions, I wasn't going to stick around to find out. That trip taught me a hard lesson about the risks of venturing too far off the beaten path alone. I still love the wilderness, but now I'm more cautious. Some places are better left undisturbed. I've always loved the outdoors, and camping was something I considered a sort of escape. Life in the city had become too noisy, too crowded, and honestly, too suffocating. I needed a break, so I decided to spend a weekend alone in the woods. I chose a spot deep in the forest, about a 3-hour drive from home. It wasn't a popular camping area, which is exactly what I wanted: peace, solitude, and nature. I packed my gear carefully: tent, sleeping bag, food, water, first aid kit, and everything else I thought I'd need. I even double-checked my flashlight batteries and brought a backup just in case. The plan was simple: hike to the campsite, set up camp, spend 2 nights, and come back refreshed. The drive to the forest was uneventful. I parked my car at the designated lot, which was already almost empty, with only one other vehicle there. It looked like an old pickup truck, dusty and dented, probably belonging to someone who worked in the area or was hunting. I strapped on my backpack, locked the car, and started my hike into the woods. The trail was narrow but well-trodden, winding through towering pines and oaks. It was quiet except for the occasional rustle of leaves or chirp of a bird. I'd chosen this area specifically because it wasn't frequented by many people, and the idea of being completely alone for a while felt oddly comforting. After about an hour, I reached my campsite. It was a small clearing surrounded by dense trees, with a slight incline on one side and a rocky outcrop on the other. A stream ran nearby, its gentle gurgling adding to the serene atmosphere. I set up my tent near the edge of the clearing, far enough from the stream to avoid any flooding but close enough for easy access to water. Once camp was set up, I gathered some firewood and got a small fire going. I spent the rest of the afternoon exploring the area, noting landmarks so I wouldn't get lost. The forest was beautiful, but it also felt heavy in a way. The trees were so thick that sunlight barely reached the forest floor, and there was an overwhelming sense of isolation. Still, I reminded myself that this was what I'd wanted, a break from the chaos of life. That night, after dinner, I sat by the fire and stared at the stars. The sky was clear, and without the light pollution of the city, the stars seemed endless. It was the kind of beauty that made you feel small in the best way. Eventually, I crawled into my tent, zipped up the flap, and fell asleep to the sound of the stream. I woke up suddenly in the middle of the night. It wasn't a noise that woke me. At least, I don't think it was. It was more of a feeling, like something wasn't right. I lay there for a moment, listening. The forest was eerily quiet. No rustling leaves, no crickets, nothing. That kind of silence felt unnatural. I unzipped the tent just enough to peek out. The fire had died down to embers, casting a faint orange glow over the clearing. I scanned the area but didn't see anything unusual. Telling myself I was just being paranoid, I zipped the tent back up and tried to sleep. The next morning, I felt a bit off but chalked it up to not sleeping well. After breakfast, I decided to go for a longer hike, leaving most of my gear at the campsite. I marked my trail as I went, using bright strips of fabric tied to branches. About 2 miles into the hike, I stumbled upon something strange. It was a campsite, but it looked abandoned. The tent was collapsed, torn in places, and the fire pit was cold, with scattered ashes and half-burnt logs. There was a backpack nearby, its contents spilled out. A jacket, some cans of food, and a flashlight. The whole scene looked like it had been left in a hurry. I stood there for a while, debating whether to investigate further. Eventually, curiosity got the better of me. I picked up the backpack and looked through it. There wasn't much to go on, just some basic supplies and a notebook. The notebook was damp, the pages smudged, but I could make out a few entries. Most of it was mundane stuff, notes about hiking routes, weather observations, but the last entry caught my attention. Something is following me. I can't see it, but I know it's there. I hear it at night. I don't think I'm alone out here. A chill ran down my spine. I stuffed the notebook back into the bag and decided to head back to my campsite. The feeling of being watched was growing stronger with every step. When I got back to my campsite, everything seemed fine, but I couldn't shake the unease. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see, I didn't even know what. I told myself I was just spooked by the abandoned campsite and the notebook. Still, I couldn't relax. That night, I kept the fire burning brighter and stayed outside my tent, sitting close to the flames. The forest was quiet again, the same unnatural silence from the night before. Around midnight, I heard something. It was faint at first, like footsteps crunching leaves. I froze, straining to hear. The footsteps were deliberate, slow, and getting closer. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it into the trees, but the light didn't reach far. I called out, asking if anyone was there, but there was no response. The footsteps stopped, but the feeling of being watched didn't go away. I stayed by the fire for the rest of the night, gripping my flashlight like a weapon. By dawn, I'd made up my mind to cut the trip short. I packed up my gear as quickly as I could, constantly looking over my shoulder. The hike back to the car felt like the longest hike of my life. Every crack of a branch, every rustle of leaves, made my heart race. When I finally reached the parking lot, My car was the only one there. The old pickup truck was gone. I tossed my gear into the back seat and drove off without looking back. For weeks after that trip, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Even at home, I'd catch myself glancing out the window, half expecting to see someone or something standing there. I haven't been camping since. What unnerved me the most wasn't the footsteps or the notebook. It was the realization that, out there in the woods, I wasn't as alone as I thought I'd be.